So the next item is our response to homelessness update and direction. Good afternoon, Susie and Tina, and please.
Thank you, Mayor Watkins. Good afternoon, and council members and members of the community joining us this afternoon. Here we are 1 week later, back talking about this issue again. So similar to prior meetings, we have several agenda items to go through, and we also have several speakers. So presenting to you today, in addition to myself, will be Susie O'Hara, the assistant to the city manager. We'll have the city attorney, Tony Condotti, provide a legal overview. And we also have economic development director, Bonnie Lipscomb, helping with some of the siting locations. Oh, thank you very much. Also, Fire Chief Jason Hyduk will assist with a discussion of an update on where the Gateway encampment currently is. So you can see from the agenda, we'll first review your last direction from the meeting a week ago, provide an update on where things stand with the Gateway encampment, walk through the legal implications of the Martin versus Boise case. And we've known that there's been a lot of questions or not full clarity around what this decision means for us, as well as jurisdictions across California and everywhere within the Ninth Circuit's jurisdiction. So we'll walk through that. And then the meat of the conversation will be item number 4, and that's walking through the actionable items being presented to you this evening. I'm wrapping up with summary staff recommendations and requests for council direction. Okay, so first, just to recap the council's action at your last meeting a week ago. You have copies there, and everyone can see it up on the screen. So 1 and A, that is occurring. That is still on track, again, with the Salvation Army as the operator. On B, that is what will be the large substance of this afternoon's discussion, is talking about the small scale, no more than 50 bed pilot program to open by the deadline of April 17th. Item C and D are subsets of that transition away from the Gateway encampment. Number 2 on here actually will be covered this evening, even though there is a date of April 9th. Items 3, 4, 5, and 6 are happening and won't be discussed. So really the majority of the discussion is around 1B. All right, Susie.
All right. So, oh wow, that's strong, sorry. So Fire Chief Hyduk and I will be providing a brief update on conditions at the Gateway encampment. For the last 2 meetings, I've talked in great detail about the level of outreach and engagement as well as camp conditions. I'm not going to talk about that tonight or today. What I just wanted to provide a brief update on from the staff's perspective from the city manager's office is we really have made strides in developing great coordination with the camp council. This week, for instance, we will be working with them on significant debris removal that they are spearheading through coordination with the city. We will be bringing in tomorrow a number of refuse containers and really working to facilitate the work that they want to do around this. So last week, Megan and I met with the camp council. There was probably about 25, maybe 20 to 25 people there as well last Friday. And that was Fire Chief Hyduk as well. I'm really trying to engage with the council and set up a few different subcommittees that were focused on safety and really serving the camp residents so we can have a better understanding of who's there and their needs. On those 2 fronts, the folks that we met with last week have been instrumental in really helping the city dialogue more effectively and understand their needs. So as I mentioned, tomorrow we're going to be helping with moving refuse out of the camp. The area that was noted last week, the kind of the triangular area at the top of the encampment adjacent to the levee, has already been vacated. Those folks have moved into the greater footprint of the camp. So I fully expect a fair amount of coordination moving forward, and quite pleased with that. So for those that are here, I just want to express my gratitude to the camp council and those that are liaison-ing with the city on this. So in addition to the debris removal, We're also working on disseminating a resident survey with assistance from the Camp Council. Last week, we gave them a draft. We're going to be meeting this week on really fine-tuning that from the perspective of gathering enough information but not being too intrusive. And so I also want to express my appreciation for those that are here that are helping with us. And I will turn it over to the fire chief.
Mayor, Council, thank you, Susie. So we met last week. I think it was a very productive meeting, and what we presented was not just what we wanted to do, but more importantly, the why behind it. The why behind the fire codes that are based on actual incidents that have occurred within our city, within our state, within our nation, within the world. It's our adopted fire code. And so we took the time not just to tell people do this, but really why and what the impact would be for them individually as well as collectively within the camp. And our goals are not to impose a set of standards that are unreasonable or specific to this camp, but are the expectation and the standards that we put on anyone, regardless of where you are in the city. And so for the fire safety standards, we're really looking at the ability to have clear access lanes, no different than an exit pathway in a theater. People have the ability not to try and navigate, a maze. We also were looking at having separation between the tents. We believe that the footprint within that camp will allow for some minimum safety standards to be imposed. And then we also discussed the incident that we had with the fire inside of the tent and the hazards of cooking inside and not to have any open flame devices in there, as well as compressed gases. There's a number of propane bottles that are being used for different reasons. And within an enclosed space, not only is it a fire hazard, but it's also an asphyxiant. And so this is for their safety as well as the total camp. And we had really good feedback, I believe, from that. We posted those signs up around there. I was down there this afternoon, and they've already kind of started rearranging some of the structures that are down there, removing some of the debris. And like Susie said, we'll be bringing in some containers to complete that. And this is something that they're doing voluntarily after we had that meeting. So I'm pleased to say that we're making some progress. And this is no different than the approach we would take with any business. We're not looking to close people down. We're looking to get education and compliance. And so we're following the same tack that we would do with any business in the city or any resident within the city. So I'm optimistic that by this weekend, things will be much better than they were last week. WebEOC is, I talked about it last week, it's that portal or that device that we can put all of our information in one place. We're still working on getting it up and running and being perfect, but it's much better than it was last week. We're getting information from the county side. We're inputting information from the city side so we can track what progress we've done. We can also see what accomplishments have occurred. Vector control, we had a number, after Dr. left and the county vector control came out and they were concerned about the rodent population and the transmission of disease within that population and then also outside of that community. We got bids from a number of different companies that were willing to come in, and we are in the process of getting that PO done through the city so that we can start that. So we will have active trapping of rodents down there. A number of those will be retained and given to the county so that they can test them for any diseases to make sure that if we don't have a problem, we can confirm that. If we do have a disease that's identified, we can work on that. So I would expect that that work would be in place by this next coming weekend for that. Are there any questions?
Any questions from the council? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Hyduk. So then the next segment of the agenda we'll move on to is a presentation from the City Attorney, Tony Condotti, talking through some of the legal constraints and legal issues that have presented themselves anew with this encampment.
Yes, thank you, Tina, and Mayor, members of the City Council. We're going to talk about the Martin versus Boise case that's been bantered about a lot in the past several months since it was issued back in September of 2018. When that case was issued, the police department immediately ceased enforcing our city camping ban ordinance, which is codified at Chapter 6.36 of the Municipal Code. Martin versus Boise is a decision issued by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that involved a lawsuit that was brought by homeless individuals that sought a court declaration that Boise's ordinance prohibiting camping on public property was unconstitutional, and also seeking an injunction or court order that prohibited the city from enforcing its ordinance going into the future. It's worth noting that the ordinance in question in the Boise case was very similar, strikingly similar to the ordinance that's been on the books in the city of Santa Cruz since the mid-1960s. And so that's why it has an impact on the city, both because the city of Santa Cruz in California is located within the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is directly below the United States Supreme Court, encompasses several western states, including Idaho. And so that's why the Boise case is applicable here. In the Martin case, the Ninth Circuit relied heavily on a United States Supreme Court case from 1962 that struck down a California statute that classified narcotics addiction as a criminal offense. And that case, which is entitled Robinson versus California, stands for the notion that the Eighth Amendment prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment that's in our Constitution prohibits the state from punishing an involuntary act or condition if it is the unavoidable consequence of one's status or being. In Martin, the Ninth Circuit applied that principle and stated this principle compels the conclusion that the Eighth Amendment prohibits the imposition of criminal penalties for sitting, sleeping, or lying outside on public property for homeless individuals who cannot obtain shelter. Essentially, the court is indicating that we can't criminalize a person's conduct if that conduct is inherently the product of their status. In this case, the homeless individuals sleeping on streets is the product of their homelessness. So the Martin case makes this sweeping pronouncement, but then immediately offers some narrowing language that makes its application seem not so sweeping. So it's part of the frustrations of this profession is that courts issue decisions, and then it's our job to try to interpret what they mean when applied to different sets of facts and different circumstances. So the narrowing constructions were, court says, we in no way dictate that the city must, to the city that it must provide sufficient shelter for the homeless or allow anyone who wishes to sit, lie, or sleep on the streets at any time and at any place. The court goes on, our holding does not cover individuals who have access to adequate temporary shelter, whether because they have the means to pay for it or because it is realistically available to them for free, but who choose not to use it. Nor do we suggest that a jurisdiction with insufficient shelter can never criminalize the act of sleeping outside. Even where shelter is unavailable, an ordinance prohibiting sitting, lying, or sleeping outside at particular times or in particular locations might well be constitutionally permissible. So too might an ordinance barring the obstruction of public rights-of-way or the erection of certain structures. And whether some other ordinance is consistent with the Eighth Amendment will depend on whether it punishes a person for lacking the means to live out the universal and unavoidable consequences of being human in the way the ordinance prescribes. So this doesn't mean we're obligated to allow homeless people to sleep on our streets or on public property whenever or wherever they so choose. But unfortunately, Martin doesn't provide that much meaningful guidance on how or to what extent we can regulate these activities. So we're left with the task of doing that. That, like I said, is how our legal system works. A higher court issues a decision anticipating that lower courts will interpret it to different sets of facts and circumstances, and that the law will be developed around the basic principles that are enunciated in the case. And the Martin case was only decided in September of 18, so there's not a lot of case law interpreting it so far, but there is some guidance, and one case is a United States District Court case called Miral versus City of Oakland. In that case, the plaintiffs were homeless individuals who established an encampment on city-owned property that they entitled the Housing and Dignity Village. They set up a camp, and it was on vacant Oakland property in violation of Oakland's ordinances and regulations, just in the same fashion that the Ross camp is. The city decided that it wanted to shut the camp down, and so it posted notices to vacate the illegal campground, indicating that the site would be cleared and closed. This happened in late October of 2018, and the city's notice indicated that it would close the site on November 10th of 2018. On November 9th, plaintiffs who were residents or occupants of the encampment filed a lawsuit in the United States District Court, basically saying that the city's contemplated action was in violation of their Eighth Amendment rights as interpreted by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Martin. And they sought a temporary restraining order and an injunction to prohibit the city from moving forward with the closure. Initially, the court granted the temporary restraining order that sort of preserved the status quo for a few weeks, and then I think on the 26th of November, the case was heard on their motion for preliminary injunction. The claims that were made in the Morale case by the plaintiffs were that the city's attempt to remove them from the Housing and Dignity Village's location on public land was a violation of their Eighth Amendment rights based on Martin, and also that the closure and the removal of their property would violate their due process rights under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is the Due Process Clause. So in countering the plaintiff's claims, the city represented that any encampment closure would be conducted in accordance with a set of standard operating procedures that the city had prepared and adopted for purposes of dealing with these types of situations, which, along with providing certain notice requirements, included also offering the occupants shelter beds and resources, both prior to and during the closure, and an offer of assistance with moving their personal belongings before the closure or while the closure was happening. The court found that the plaintiffs were not faced with punishment for acts inherent to their unhoused status that they could not control, nor were they unable to obtain shelter outside of this encampment based on the city's commitment in its papers and at the hearing to provide them with temporary shelter assistance prior to and during the closure. Basically, the court said Martin doesn't establish a constitutional right to occupy public property indefinitely at plaintiff's option. So if you go back and look at the Martin case, it focused specifically on the available of temporary alternative shelter locations. It doesn't stand for the proposition that the city's obligated to provide some permanent housing solution in order to close an illegally established encampment like the Ross camp. The court found that the plaintiffs were not faced with punishment for acts inherent to their unhoused status. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. And accordingly, the court found that the plaintiffs did not show a likelihood of success or raise serious questions as to the merits of their Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment claim, which is the standard for injunctive relief. The court also rejected the 14th Amendment due process claim. Although homeless individuals' unabandoned possessions are property within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, and that means that the city has to comport with due process requirements when it takes action to either take that property or to remove it from their possession. That means that it has to provide notice and give the property owners a chance to try to argue against the taking. So in countering the due process claim, the city presented evidence to the court that the enclosure would be conducted in accordance with its SOP, which required posting a 72-hour notice of closure at multiple visible locations on the site, storage of any property left at the site after closure, other than property that's deemed unsafe or hazardous, such as food, soiled clothing, biohazard materials, that sort of things. posting a notice of collected property at the encampment, giving information to the occupants as to where the property is being held so that they could come and claim it at a later time, and an offer of assistance with moving belongings after the closure. The court found that the city's SOP on its face provided adequate notice and opportunity for the plaintiffs to be heard before the property was seized. So turning back to the prior discussion about the Ross camp, the Morale case provides the city with a roadmap for effecting a closure of that encampment in a manner that doesn't run afoul of the constitutional principles established in the Martin versus Boise case. So just very quickly, the legal requirements that the legal requirements that are being developed as the city's standard operating procedure include notifying persons residing in the encampment that it's been declared uninhabitable and will be closed, including posting notice to vacate, signage prominently at the encampment, offering shelter beds or alternative shelter locations and resources to individuals at the encampment prior to and during the closure, as well as an offer of assistance with moving and storage of personal belongings. To the extent possible, documenting the identities of the occupants and documenting that notice has been provided in accordance with the SOP, allowing the occupants to retrieve their personal belongings before vacating the site, documenting the conditions, including photographs before cleanup, disposing of belongings that are clearly trash or unsafe for long-term storage, collecting, bagging, and labeling personal property so that it can be reclaimed at a later date, itemizing belongings collected, include the location, date, and time of collection on an itemization form, posting notice at the site where, with including contact information for retrieval of the property, and then storage of the property for at least a 90-day period to enable people to claim their personal property. And lastly, a cleanup of the site once it's been vacated to remove trash and debris and hazardous materials or biohazards. Just one final point that I'd like to add is that complying with these constitutional standards is something that we're obligated to do under the law at the risk of exposing both city officials and city law enforcement officers to substantial personal financial liability. So it's not just a feel-good thing that we're trying to do to say that we're able to respect people's constitutional rights, but we're following a legally mandated procedure here. And I'm happy to answer any questions or respond to comments.
We'll go ahead and pause to see if there's any questions from the council. Councilmember Cruz?
So it seems like there's a catch-22 here, or rock and hard place. How much space do we have to provide? Do we do it? Is there any any census count, and then figure out if we don't provide, if there's 50 people, do we have to have beds identified, or just places for people to go?
That's one of those questions that I can't really answer definitively based on the facts that were presented in the Martin case and the way it was applied. We do know that certain individuals are not going to accept offers of shelter based on some very minimal standards that would likely be established for admission, including not using illegal narcotics on site and that sort of thing. We're not obligated to provide a completely condition-free environment for people who don't want to adhere to basic rules of behavior for a shelter. But we do have to be able to document the number of people that were there and that shelter space was available for those who choose to avail themselves of it.
Would it be safe to say that if 80 people said, yes, I want to abide by the rules and get a shelter bed, and we only had 70, what would we...
Our plan is to locate sufficient alternative locations for the individuals that are out there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Myers, then Councilmember Brown, and then Vice Mayor Cummings.
To the extent that they choose to avail themselves of what is offered.
I was just curious about the temporary nature, sort of Is that temporary? Is there any guidance or any decisions on what temporary?
For purposes of abating, closing an encampment, what we have to be able to demonstrate is that there is a reasonable alternative temporary location available on that occasion. We don't have to be able to demonstrate that it's a shelter that will be available for any particular duration, but I would imagine, 30 days, 45 days, something like that, at least to enable both the city to continue to work to identify alternative locations and to place people into available shelter services that we have, and to enable the individuals to seek alternative shelter options for them as well.
Councilor Brown.
So just to clarify, that the basis of the plaintiff's claims being rejected was the basis was a review of standard operating procedure, and as we know, procedures and policies don't get followed sometimes. So I'm just wondering, and I understand your research was related to the case law itself, but if staff and any of your looking into this, has there been any, is there any indication that, I guess what I'm saying is that simply having the procedure doesn't mean that it's followed, and I'm just wondering if there's any discussion around that, if anything in the proceedings of the case discuss that, anything we should know, because that's a concern of mine.
I do think it's instructive to just consider the procedural manner in which the case was brought forward, in which a lawsuit was filed before the city implemented the procedure that it had adopted, and the court based its decision on the city's representation in the court papers that it filed and in the argument that was presented in the court hearings, expressing the city's commitment to adhere to the procedures that it had adopted and promulgated. So I fully anticipate that any procedures that we establish for moving forward with the closure will need to be followed in order to protect the city from potential liability.
Just a quick follow-up. So you're not aware of any follow-up complaints about procedure not being followed following this decision?
In the Oakland case you're talking about? I'm not, but I'm also aware that the plaintiffs in that case had argued that the city had closed several campsites on prior occasions and said that the city had not adhered to those policies on those prior occasions. And the city's response, as I understand it from just communicating with the attorneys who represented the city in that case, was that the city had been developing and was in the process of implementing a new standard operating procedure that was the procedure that was applied in this case. And so the city said, we're not saying we did everything perfectly in the past. These are the procedures that we're following now.
Thank you. So just for clarification purposes, what would the consequences be if, for example, we were to close the camp with no alternatives tomorrow or insufficient alternatives?
So, I mean, as Chief Mills will also tell you, the police department works under a set of adopted policies and procedures that are designed to ensure that its law enforcement activities are undertaken in a manner that's consistent with established law. And one of the reasons why they do it, in addition to the fact that it's good public policy, but another reason they do it is that so long as they're following in good faith clearly established laws, or at least they're not failing to adhere to laws that are clearly established that they can't do. I didn't say that very articulately. If there's a law that's not clearly established, but they're acting in good faith based on the belief that what they're doing is consistent with a person's civil rights, then they're entitled to qualified immunity, to a certain level of protection from the courts if someone is injured or if there's damage to property or something of that nature that arises from law enforcement activities. So long as the police department's acting in good faith, they're entitled to a level of immunity from civil liability for that. If the law is clearly established and we don't follow it, not only does the city have liability exposure, we could face significant damages, but the individual officers who are out there trying to implement it face individual exposure to liability for their own personal assets. And so, not adhering to a decision like Martin once it comes out is not an option for us.
My other question, in the absence of having, for right now, for example, the Ross camp is kind of our alternative for not having camps established throughout different neighborhoods within Santa Cruz. Is that
sort of a de facto encampment in the city that likely would not be here but for the legal landscape that we're now operating in? Right?
So if that alternative wasn't available, what would our enforcement measures be around people establishing in other parts of the city?
So as I mentioned as part of the presentation, the law does not require us to make shelter space available for the homeless. It simply doesn't require it. But if we want to enforce regulations that restrict areas where people can set up shop on public property and camp, we can't tell a person who's homeless that there's no place in the city where they can sleep legally. So it doesn't impose any mandate on the city to provide shelter space. It just restricts the law enforcement tools at our disposal against people who have no alternative but sleeping outdoors because of their homeless status.
Councilmember Glover.
Thank you. Just this kind of question for you, Tony, and then also for the fire chief. Is he still in here? With the new easements and clear paths and structures set up for fire safety that you were just mentioning in the camp, fire chief, how many tents does that suffice, or how much space does that provide for tents at the Ross camp with the structures that you're getting them to make it if it were to be organized? And
I don't have a really good answer for that just because of the setup of it. That space was not engineered for what it's being currently used at, and there's some issues besides fire separation. I could go back and look at the square footage and tell you that this is what we would do. The problem with the fire code is it's really designed for tents over 400 square feet. It talks about the ability to impose standards that you think are reasonable for a tent that's underneath that, because they're made for transient occupation. They're not designed to be lived in, for a month at a time or further, just because of their design and what they're made out of. So I could go back and give you a better answer about what kind of clear separation we would want, and how many people or how many tents we could fit in there, with the idea that those tents were all the same size,
right,
and the same shape. That would be a much easier proposition. What we've asked the camp that's currently there to do is a bare minimum.
right.
It's there to make things better than what we have currently, but it is not what I would lay out if we were starting from scratch.
And based on your estimations, how many people how many additional spaces, just to reiterate, would we need to open up in order to effectively remove all people that inhabit the camp currently?
Well, we're hoping that the survey, we can get a definite number for that. The problem with our existing structure that we have is that there's a nighttime population and a daytime population. They are not static from day to day. So we've done some surveys in the morning on different times, and at those times, at that particular point in time, 60 to 70% of the tents were occupied. I don't know if that has changed because we have not gone out in the last week to look at that. So that's just a number, and it's like the point in time count. It's
right.
a number that you get for that particular moment. I don't think that all the tents are inhabited all the time.
Okay, thank you. And then for City Attorney Kandati, what is the legal ramifications of, say we set a day that we're going to close the camp and we start to transition people out? What if new people transition into the camp during that transition time? Would that reset the number to the amount of people that are currently physically in the camp before it is able to be removed, or?
Well, I think that part of our operational plan would be to ensure that new encampments aren't just set up as we're, so I don't think we will allow people to just come in and start setting up camp while we are in the process of vacating others. So we're just going to have to monitor that and enforce that as we implement the plan.
So, but even with, say we open up enough shelter beds to close the Ross camp and transition everyone in, that still will leave us unable to enforce said ordinances or regulations in other parts of the city because we have maxed out our shelter bed options and are back to square one.
That's a good point. Dealing with the situation that we have out at the Ross camp does not change the legal landscape that we're in terms of our ability to enforce our camping ordinance against people who are homeless.
So would you?
It will enable us to address that nuisance situation that we have out there right now, but it doesn't provide us with a long-term viable strategy for restricting camping in different parts of the city on public property.
Just one more, if that's okay. So in your opinion, in order for us to be able to effectively enforce laws that govern sleeping and camping in public spaces, we would need to make a drastic increase in our shelter bed and temporary bed availability in the city.
That's one way of looking at it, but I think based on the narrowing construction that the court applied in the Ninth Circuit case, another way to look at it is if we are going to enforce an ordinance that prohibits camping on public property in a given instance, we have to be able to demonstrate in that instance that the person who is cited or who the enforcement action is brought against had an alternative.
Thank you.
Mayor, may I add just one thing to that? So at the point in time that we're ready with new sheltering programs coming online at 1220 and with the program that we will be discussing today, it's not just those two programs for which we will be looking at capacity, it's also the other programs that we have in the community. So at that time, we would be looking to the Loft, we would be looking to the VFW, we would be looking to the Laurel Street program as well. So it's a little bit more complicated than what's online at the time of closure.
And I'll just remind the community that we'll have an opportunity to hear from you. So please, if possible, keep your comments to yourself. And when you have the opportunity to come speak to us, we'll allow for you to be heard at that time. Okay, I know we have more presentation. Councilmember Myers, you have a question?
At any given point in time, do we have knowledge of who will be in a bed or not in a bed or in a shelter or not in a shelter, and when those decisions are made so that we can track to some extent the availability at any given time during a process of?
Yeah, so one thing that we've talked about over the last couple meetings is the development that the Web EOC model is open. And one of the major new characteristics of that model is we will actually have a point-in-time census of available shelter beds day by day that we will be able to provide to folks that are doing outreach, either at the Gateway encampment or out in the community. And those will be real-time filled based on whoever is engaging and whoever might have an interest in moving into shelter. So that is a new kind of outcome of this process in coordination with the city and the county as it relates to maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, but as it relates to figuring out exactly who's at the encampment at the time that we intend to move forward with a closure, that information will also be part of the Web EOC in terms of documentation, so we'll be able to refer to that ongoing.
And that will be for beds throughout Santa Cruz County?
Yes.
Thank you.
Please continue.
Okay, where are we? Okay, so this is me. And I'll try to move forward through this pretty quickly because we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I did want to mention that as we have been going through this process and meeting week by week with council on these two different programs, I want to talk about this process of information gathering and discovery that has led staff to make a recommendation for this evening. So wanted to give you just a brief overview of the distinction between a transitional encampment and a safe sleeping and storage program. So as you'll notice highlighted in green, those are really the key distinctions, who they are operated by, whether it's self-governed or fully operated by a nonprofit. So transitional encampments, there is an element of self-governance and really, I think, in effective community building on behalf of the residents of the encampments. That is an important piece of the picture that I think is important as we consider transitional encampments through the project charter. That's one of the critical pieces as to what I've understood to the success of those programs. Transitional encampments are open 24/7, so folks have an opportunity to be there during the day as well. When you think about that within the context of a safe sleeping and storage program, which you directed at our last meeting to really consider either of those from the perspective of the pilot. The Safe Sleeping and Storage Program, generally speaking, is operated by either a nonprofit or a city government or county government jurisdiction. It's really a dusk to dawn program in that open at 9 p.m., closed at 6 a.m. For the point, the distinction between the two programs is really that. And then also, how does the program look and feel during the time that it's open? A transitional encampment that you might find on a public space or at a church or on private property throughout the community, that is something that is there 24/7. There are structures, there are people coming in and out, whereas a safe sleeping and storage program is only open at night. In large part, structures are individual structures are removed during the day. So what you would basically see during the day is space where there might be a storage container, there might be an office container, refuse collection, hygiene, porta potties, etc. But in large part, apart from maybe operators that are coming in to clean and maintain the facility, you do not see folks that are using the shelter as clients there during the day. So that's the big distinction. Otherwise, as we're considering safe sleeping and storage sites and transitional encampments, generally speaking, the rules are very similar in terms of rules of conduct that people are expected to maintain. One of the big distinctions, I think, between safe sleeping and transitional encampments, safe sleeping really does offer a very flexible day-by-day approach for whoever is interested in accessing it, are able to use it. So in having thoughts about what optimal flexible model can we consider as we consider the needs out at the Gateway encampment, it really has, I've had some crystallization around thoughts between these two programs that I kind of wanted to walk through. But as you'll see in the slide, generally speaking, the programs are very similar in terms of storage offered on site, infrastructure provided by the government agency that's part of the program, one point of entry and exit, and that usually is a manned gate that is being very well managed. And then in terms of barriers to entry, expectations around rules of conduct are pretty paramount, but we can get into the nuances about what that means in terms of some of the barriers that we've been talking about with regard to substance use disorder, et cetera. So with that in mind, I'm going to set the table for Bonnie, who's going to come up after me to talk about site selection. So between the last meeting and this meeting, we really have put some deep thought into, given the urgency of trying to close the Gateway encampment within the context of Martin versus Boise and in partnership with the county through the Joint Action Plan, what is the appropriate model given the site constraints that we have right now, and then also just given the sense that we're trying to move quickly to improve conditions for our greater community, but also our residents of the Gateway encampment. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what was noted in the agenda report. We did have a meeting with nonprofit operators in our faith-based community today at 12, so just a few hours ago. about 25 people came, and it was really just opening dialogue with the city and partners about the level of interest and capacity to not only cite this type of program, but operate, and questions about how to make them the most successful that we possibly can. We had a diverse cross-section of community members that came to the meeting, faith-based, nonprofit, advocates and activists in the homelessness community. And in large part, I think there is very strong interest in supporting the city and the county through this process, but also a very strong interest in developing a clear set of engagement and dialogue and really trying to help our community come together to look at options. So nobody raised their hand necessarily to cite a program outside of a city parcel. So I really did want to have an opportunity to see if there was anybody who wanted to jump on board. That did not happen. In terms of operator capacity, I think it's going to be challenging to find an operator who can stand up a program this quickly, and we can talk a little bit more about that as well. I want to mention that I think there's been some concern that the Pacific Northwest programs are not successful within the context of how they are affecting homelessness in general. We talked about this 2 meetings ago, but I think given the pace of this, I think it's important to say it again. The intention of these programs is to create alternative and innovative sheltering models that fit into the continuum of care, not solve homelessness. I don't think the Pacific Northwest communities, Seattle, Portland, Eugene, that we are talking about, are experiencing a relief around homelessness because they have these encampments open. They are simply a different model that meets the needs of a different cross-section of folks in the community. So I just wanted to be really clear that by virtue of comparing these programs to the Seattle program, for instance, we're not suggesting from staff's perspective that this is a silver bullet in solving homelessness. It is not. So the Safe Sleeping program does offer, and I alluded to this a second ago, more flexibility in meeting a diverse cross-section of needs. It also creates day-to-day opportunities for access. So somebody who might come on Tuesday cannot come on Wednesday, but then they can come back on Thursday. So that's something to think about as we think about comparing the two models. We can bring a safe sleeping and storage program on very quickly, and I can talk about how that might work. And also, as I mentioned with this morning's meeting, I do believe that our community needs a little bit of extra time in considering transitional encampments. I've done a lot of work in thinking about how they might fit into the community. We have engaged very deliberately with the Gateway Encampment residents as to how a transitional encampment might meet their needs. I do think we need to engage with a greater cross-section of our community on this and really help with a process of creating dialogue about what this means in terms of impacts, not only to the clients and residents of the encampment, but also to the greater community and neighborhoods. So with that in mind, setting the table for the site selection, we are, as staff, recommending for the council to consider a safe sleeping and storage program at this time and not a transitional encampment, but really taking a deliberate pause and thinking about how can we best create success through the project charter process and bring our community together in dialogue. And this is across the entire stakeholder demographic that I talked about at the last meeting, from those with lived experience to those business, neighbors who might also be, and neighbors that might be affected by a program that we move forward with. Yeah, okay. I think I queued you up already, but a couple times. So with that all in mind, Bonnie is going to, Lipscomb, our economic development director, is going to be walking through our site selection process.
Great. Thanks, Susie, and good afternoon or evening, Mayor and members of the council. I'm going to recap a few of the process that we went through in identifying the initial pass of looking at sites. And previously, when we came before you, we were looking at it from the perspective, as Susie mentioned, of the possibility of potential transitional encampment sites and/or safe sleeping programs. So as we go forward today, this will be focusing on safe sleeping sites. So just to recap the process that we went through, and first I just want to acknowledge just the tremendous amount of staff across the city that has been engaged in vetting sites, coming up with the parameters, looking closely at each site for suitability across infrastructure, making sure utilities, water, all of these things. It has been a real city lift. So there are no fewer than 8 departments, including the city manager's office, that's been involved, including Public Works, water, fire department, police, Parks and Rec, and who am I leaving out? IT as well, and planning. So it has really been an all hands on deck. And I also need to acknowledge David McCormick, who's our asset property manager, who's really done a tremendous amount of work going deep on each of the sites and making sure that it met the parameters that we've discussed as the whole city team. So within, and we really also focused within the city, Santa Cruz city limits, there are over 500 parcels, including some sites that the city owns outside of the city, but we really felt like because of we control the land use within the city and also from accessibility, and as we're looking at safe sleeping sites, we thought pedestrian access was important. We really narrowed it down to, the initial look of 215 parcels within the city limits that are 5,000 square feet or larger. Thanks. And then we further evaluated these sites from the last week when we came before you, specifically for suitability for safe sleeping and storage sites. So the coming around 9 p.m. in the evening or so and staying until the morning. And then during the day, we looked at compatibility of uses, making sure that, some minimal storage and sanitation facilities could stay on site, but the site would largely return to whatever its use is normally during the day. So in the process of looking at the 215 parcels, we had identified a number of sites, and this is a recap of last week. I think the one that we've added, there were 16 critical water facilities that we discussed in more detail last week that just aren't suitable for any type of occupation. Additionally, DeMayo Lane was another site due to its remote access that just wasn't ideal for the type of use that we are talking about. So from that, we narrowed it down to 6 sites. And primarily, we narrowed it down to those 6 sites within the core area. And we discussed this briefly last week, but specifically, we were looking at accessibility, proximity to transit, both the Metro bus stations and another map will show you the transit routes, utilities to the site, being able to have refuse service for pickup, overall security, safety, public services, police access, nearby social services, also within the core area, being the primary urban area, it's more limited habitat impacts than some of our outlying parks area that we are initially looking at. And then the individuals remain part of the community and being part of the city core. And so the 6 sites we identified, the first site, and I'll go through these in a little more detail, but basically we took these 6 sites that we presented last week and we went back and did additional analysis, and we looked further after the first pass at the actual infrastructure we get to the site. So we looked really closely at that. We looked at access and proximity to the central core. We looked at usable space and just suitability overall for the intended use. And again, this time the lens was looking more specifically with a specific intention as a safe sleeping and storage site. And then clear site control. We had 2 sites that we needed to go a little deeper on whether or not they were completely within our control. We had some use agreements. We also had some title issues that we needed to clear up on one of the sites, and we'll go through that in a little more detail. So of those 6 sites, we through the further analysis narrowed it down to 3. And so I'll briefly just explain why we eliminated these 3 sites. So the first site, the former reservoir site owned by the water department, It's not a good site for safe sleeping. It's too remote for pedestrian access. As you can see, it's quite a bit of ways from most of the social services in town, and just from pedestrian access, it's pretty far to walk. It's also it's an unimproved site, and the drainage is fairly poor there, and there's some adjacent conflicts. So that site was removed. The additional site we removed was Lot 3. Is site number 3, which is Lot 17. And I'll go through these, and if you have more questions about this. This is the site that we have. It's close to the Warriors Arena. It's actually adjacent to the Warriors Arena. It's a long diagonal site. You can't see it because the X covers it up, but it's a site that we have some state right-of-way issues, and so we have it's unclear to us what we have to deal with on the right-of-way for that site. It also we have refuse service for multiple users around the area that from loading and unloading would have to go in through that we'd have to accommodate. And because the site's long and linear, it does complicate things. And then finally, we have a use agreement with the Warriors for ADA and handicap spaces related to their uses, so it really limits it. I think if you were looking at, this safe sleeping area, in theory, we thought maybe that would work, but when we actually looked at the timing of the use of the arena, it actually still conflicts. So we removed that site. And then finally, we removed the wharf yard. And this is one where we're still trying to clear up the title on this site, but separately from that, so we don't have site control at this time. Separately from that, it also has poor drainage. It's essential for wharf operations. We thought, we'll look at it. It's a large site. Maybe we could combine the uses on it. But in looking more closely and looking at actually the massive amount of materials and pilings that they have stored on the site, to actually make that site available would be quite intensive and probably not ready. We couldn't make it ready in time for the intended purpose. So for that reasons, we removed these 3 sites from consideration, which gives us 3 remaining sites, and we'll go through those in a little more detail. So the 3 sites that are remaining, again, is lot number 2. Sorry, I keep saying that. Site 2, which is lot 24. And just to orient you, this is a section of the northern parking lot north of Depot Park behind Washington Street. And then site number 4 is East Cliff Drive. Right off of East Cliff Drive. And then site number 5 is San Lorenzo Park. And we'll go a little more in depth in the next slides. So here's site 2, lot 24. As you can see, this is just a portion of the city parking lot north of Depot Park. I'm only showing you a photo of the portion that we're considering for the safe sleeping site. It's roughly 52 spaces. We do have, a couple concerns. I'll go over through those in a second, but this is just so that you have a visual of the area we're talking about. So here's the portion of the site. As you can see, the total lot north of Depot is about 125 spaces, and so the area we're looking at is about 52 spaces. Opportunities on site, we do have water on site. It's accessible, it's near to services and public safety, it's paved, and there's lighting on site. So it definitely has some benefits. Some concerns, we do have 70 UCSC permits in the overall lot, in the whole 125 spaces. They're not site specific, but they are to the lot. So we need to accommodate for that. That's largely during the day. We have 18 park and ride permit holders as well. So we are still looking at whether or not we can use the entire area that you see outlined in yellow. There may be 10 or so parking spaces that we need to accommodate, but we think with sort of a shared parking model, shared use model, that we should be able to accommodate on this site. But we also have, just to orient you to the key and what we've done for each of the site, is that and it's a little hard to see on this map, but we have shown the water, stormwater, sewer, the limits to the campsite, and including a 25-foot setback. We did that for all sites, although some we may want to consider using part of the setback. It's a requirement for near residential. This isn't particularly a residential site, but we still wanted to show what a 25-foot and just for scaling look like on here. There is some limited visibility to the site. There is some potential traffic impact that we would need to look at from Laurel Street during the evening hours till morning. We would be cutting off that access. This parking lot connects to the other one with the private housing development that connects to Laurel, and it is within a coastal zone. This just shows you, we wanted to make sure as we're looking at this site with this type of orientation that we could actually make it work as a safe sleeping site. So each of those white areas you have is roughly 10 by 10. This, again, is only just for analysis. This isn't what the final safe sleeping site would look like. We just wanted to see, can we actually fit what we're trying to accomplish? So we could fit up to, and just the base area, 27 tent areas. There's up to an additional 9 that we could accommodate that's laid out here. Area for storage, sanitation, and a food and common area. So that it is feasible to fit it on the site. This site was actually the most constrained, so we thought it was important just to make sure from initial vetting that this would work. Okay, so moving on, so that's to the next site is Site 4. This is East Cliff Drive. And there's 2 potential locations here. The site's fairly large, and this is the lower area that's adjacent to East Cliff Drive, and this is the central location. It's approximately 9,200 square feet. The water meter has nearby access. Electric is available nearby. It is a flood-resistant site for the 2 areas that we've identified, and it's accessible and visible. So the first site is the central location. There are concerns, and I'll show you, and then we can go ahead and go to the next one. And so this one is just another potential layout of the area that we could have. The main differences between the 2 is this one's a little more visible from East Cliff Drive. They both are roughly the same site analysis. This is just more of a frontage location. There are some concerns. There's no formal crossing, pedestrian crossing, so that is a concern that we were looking at on this one. This site does drain to the river. Obviously, there's some community impacts with the adjacent Ocean View Park, and it is within the coastal zone. And then the last site is San Lorenzo Benchlands, and it's important to just clarify that the area that we're looking at is the south portion of the benchlands, south of the pedestrian bridge. Some of you will, of course, recall that we've had an encampment in the past that was on the north area. This is actually the south area that we were looking at for the potential safe sleeping area. And looking at the site analysis for this, it's roughly 8,800 square feet. As I mentioned, you can see the orientation of the top. It is south of the pedestrian bridge. Water nearby in the park, electric nearby in the park. It's near to services. It's accessible and visible. Some of the concerns, there are some wildlife impacts, obviously, this close to the river. And then also, as we'll talk about in a second, to the upper areas, the contingency site in the upper park area. We have some concerns between the river and the pond with kingfisher, blue heron, ducks, and geese, just overall. We do think that some of the community impacts are lessened by being in the southern area versus the northern area, just because it's a smaller footprint. But there are community impacts with major community events and celebrations that happen in the benchlands periodically. Flooding is also a concern, and we'll get into that in a second. And as you can see, the site tapers down as you go south, so it is a narrow site, but we do think it's feasible. And we needed to look at if, because of the flooding, and we all know that the benchlands flood, what's the contingency site, since this is a day-to-day looking from the safe sleeping program. And so our alternative site would be in the upper area of just of San Lorenzo Park. And this area, as we look at, has some opportunities, the same as the other are obviously the water, electric, it's flood resistant, it's accessible, has some increased visibility. However, it has some serious concerns as well. Again, it drains to the river, the community impacts, and specifically the park impacts to the adjacent playground, lawn bowling, and just the whole pedestrian cycling intersection network that travels right through here. So that's largely just an overview of the 3 remaining sites. As I said, this has been a pretty intensive across all all departments' analysis getting to these sites. And while I didn't say it at the beginning this time, I mean, there are, drawbacks to every site. No site is the perfect site. But we do think that these 3 remaining sites have enough balance in them for you to seriously consider. And if you needed to choose a site, that one of these 3 could work as a safe sleeping site. So happy to answer any site-specific questions.
Councilmember Clifford.
Thank you. Thank you for that and for all the different departments working in overtime to make sure that we can move forward on this. I'm curious, there was that great rendition or example of how many tents would fit in lot 24 or site 2. Was that kind of estimation done on the other ones just because of the number of sites or number of beds that we need to open up being approximately an additional 50 or 60?
I think our charge was up to, was it 40? 40 to 50 people. And so we did do a very preliminary one for each of the other sites. And the other sites actually are larger than the first site. So we felt like without going into, since we did not plan and lay out them for any sort of operational standpoint, we just wanted to see if they would fit. We focused on the first one that I showed you. The others are larger and it can accommodate more sites. But the first site actually could accommodate 50 with a combination of largely single, but even some double occupancy.
That's great. And then just one more. So I went down and I spoke with the camp council. I have a standing 3 o'clock Monday meeting with all of them just to talk about their perceptions. One of their concerns with some of the sites that were proposed was the idea or concept of privacy. They've received a lot of abuse from people driving by on the freeway and just the general decency of being able to wake up and walk to the bathroom without having people stare at you. So one of the sites that they were interested in exploring was up in the Poganip near the clubhouse, the retired clubhouse that's up there. I had a chance to speak with the fire chief today, and in his point of view that it is feasible to have a safe sleeping zone up there of between 40 and 50 people at the most. Has that site been looked at? And if so, what's the process?
Yeah, we looked at that site as part of the initial pass, and the remote access and the difficulty of getting up there and providing the services and everything that we needed was one of the reasons we eliminated that one.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have a question?
Just wondering about lot, is it 17 by the Warriors? Mm-hmm. Isn't the season over on March 23rd?
I don't know the exact season date, but we have year-round use agreement with the Warriors for events and other purposes and events. So we don't control as a city that calendar. The Warriors control that calendar. And
have we been looking at that site at all for a parking area, RV parking area? Because that's what I've been hearing about, but not for tents.
Not to my knowledge. No, we haven't been looking at it specifically for safe parking.
Thank you.
Follow-up question?
Yeah, just on that safe parking question, has there been any sites identified for potential safe parking? Because I noticed that we're talking about encampments and transitional encampments, but there's also the individuals in cars. And I know that we're currently working on trying to find shelter space for people to move out of the Ross camp, but has there been any exploration of safe parking sites?
So as it relates to the last council meeting, we do have direction to move forward with making a recommendation for a safe parking lot, city-owned lot to support the AFC program. But also at the last meeting, it was directed to add safe parking into the project charter for transitional encampments. So as we kind of contemplate that process, we certainly will be also contemplating potential safe parking sites as well.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Yes. I had a question with regards to lot 24. Are there any schools or daycare or anything? Actually, this goes for all the lots that are being recommended. Are there any concerns with them being in proximity to schools or daycares or anything that would, be concerning with being in proximity where a lot of children are active?
I think one of the challenges of looking at the central core is that, you could say all of these sites are going to have some impact to schools or daycare or preschool facilities. These sites, particularly being in city control and looking at the immediate adjacent uses, we felt were the best suited with those in mind, with those considerations in mind. but we can't say that any site is completely not impacted.
But also keeping in mind that the safe sleeping is a night to early morning program, and so that is also a distinction between safe sleeping and the transitional encampment, kind of that consideration as to the number of folks using that shelter model during the day that might impact neighboring uses is quite different for a safe sleeping program.
Okay. Do you have another question?
Yeah. And one more question regarding all the sites. With these safe sleeping sites, is there any control and regulation of the, like, I guess my question is, how would we be regulating the number of people that would be going into these sites? Because if there's no fencing or if there's no way to control people coming in, it could potentially overwhelm those sites if they're only, for example, if lot 24 has space for 24, 30 people.
Yeah, so actually they're fully fenced and controlled. So that is really the distinction. The fence stays up, but the infrastructure, I would say the semi kind of permanent infrastructure, storage, hygiene remains. But for safe sleeping and storage, the individual tents, or if people are actually sleeping under cover outdoors, that is removed each day. But the programs are fully fenced, likely screened for privacy, and then also controlled with a kind of one gate open access, obviously considering our fire marshal requirements.
Okay. With that, I'll turn it back to Susie and Tina, and just want to say that, we're at the point where we do feel like, any of these 3 sites could be feasible, but we really need feedback from you to be able to do any additional analysis. To the extent that you can give us feedback or direction today, we would really appreciate that.
Thank you, Bonnie. And so to that end, we have this draft slide set up that we can come back to later when you begin your discussion, where we can live input council concerns or areas for further analysis and your direction on it, so we can really go through and get that specific direction on siting. Okay, so now we're shifting to the next element of the agenda, and this is talking about the shelter crisis declaration. And this slide looks familiar. I just updated it from the slide that was presented to you last week. But for those who haven't engaged so far, what a shelter crisis is, it's a vehicle under the California Government Code that allows municipalities to have a little more freedom to move expeditiously and have less than fully to code circumstances in order to respond to the shelter crisis that is ongoing in their community. So with the finding that a significant number of persons are without the ability to obtain shelter, resulting in threat to their life and safety, this can be declared, and it does things like you can see in the second and third bullet, provides immunity from liability for ordinary negligence, and allows some suspension of state or local rules and statutes when necessary to expedite the use of public facilities for shelter. It also allows the council to adopt alternate state health and safety standards. Now, for just a quick history on this, that there is a shelter crisis declaration already in effect for the city of Santa Cruz. The city council adopted one in January of 2018. That document was in the agenda packet for this item, just to refresh everyone's recollection on that. And then we did propose, I believe, at the March 12th meeting, for March 12th meeting, a revision to that. And the council chose not to act on that. And then between that last week and this week, we've revised it again. And so I will take some time to go through this because a red line was not posted with the agenda item. I know there were questions, but when working quickly, you don't always have time to, think through everything. So I appreciate the council's forbearance and us working through it. And we also had the opportunity with having it publicly presented to get feedback from the community. So that was actually very helpful. So I will first pass around a hard copy for the city council. Could you pass that, please? And then for the members of the community, I have it saved.
Tina, is this the one that's in our packet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But I'm sending around the red line. And so this red line is off of the revised version we presented at your last meeting. And so the red line shows what was stricken and what was added since it was presented. And we thought this would be important so everyone can see. So the major changes are in a few areas that you saw referenced on the slide. One is that we provided a few more whereas clauses just to tell the story a bit more fully around the city's circumstances and why these actions were being taken. This was language that is in the original shelter crisis declaration that seemed like it would be helpful to have in there. So that's punctuated throughout this. For instance, this whereas clause here, just referencing the specific populations that make up our homeless community. In this next whereas, you can also see there's some minor editing just for clarity. Camp or lodge overnight, that could be confusing, so we just made it sleep. And so you have a few of these. This whereas references an idea in the original declaration about the city and the county working on this. This has been a joint effort, is a joint effort, more than a joint effort, all the governments in the county trying to work on this very difficult problem for us. So that's some of the changes. You'll see those references throughout. And then this whereas, so the one that was added here, whereas if the provisions of any state or local regulatory statute, regulation, or ordinance prescribing standards of housing, health, or safety are so suspended, this section authorizes the city to adopt substitute standards. So this was an area that was in the original declaration that didn't come out sharply in the revisions. So we wanted to make sure that was in there. And that's a direct reference to the government code. And this is one of the allowances of shelter crisis. And then you can see the language stricken here under the CEQA and the California Coastal Act. We felt that that was being misconstrued somewhat, that there was just knocking down every regulatory component of this. And that wasn't its intent. But again, we wanted to have a very flexible tool initially. But this created some concern, and we said, it's not necessary. It's not absolutely necessary, so let's remove it, because that was causing quite a few comments in the community. The whereas here at the bottom, this references the Homelessness Coordinating Committee and the existence of a plan. So again, getting to some of that background I discussed. This as well. And these are also, be it further resolved, clauses that were removed. These are also referencing CEQA and the California Coastal Act. So that's really the substance of the Shelter Crisis Declaration revisions, and either myself or the city attorney can answer any questions you might have, if you have any at this time.
I just have one quick question. Mm-hmm. The existing resolution that the City Council has on the books, does that currently mirror what the county has? Because if I remember correctly, in January of 2017, the city and the county both adopted a very similar resolution.
No, the way it worked is the city went first. So we went in January of 2018 because we were dealing with trying to set up our three-phase plan. And we thought this was an important tool to expedite that work. The county declared their shelter crisis in later in the year with respect to the HEAP and CASH funding. So that was the state grants that came down to our community of about $10.6 million. And in order to be eligible to access those monies, you had to have a shelter crisis declaration in effect. So we have one, so we have access to those monies. Watsonville did the same. I don't recall the exact text of the counties. Okay. I haven't looked at it in some time, so I can't comment if it's similar or dissimilar from ours. But actually, there was one other thing I wanted to point out, and it's this one. It's this top, be it further resolved right here. So this was an inclusion in the version. We added this to the version you received on March 12th. And I just want to take a moment to talk about what this is. And what this is, again, we're moving very quickly. And as we have a little more time to process and think about the intersection of this work, our existing codes and regulations and processes, wanted to be sure that we could move really expeditiously. So what this says is that in moving forward, any permits that are necessary would come straight to the City Council to be heard. Whereas normally in the ordinary course of business, they may be referred to the Planning Commission or the Parks and Recreation Commission or some other commission before it gets to you. So what this does is accelerates that regulatory timeline, again, being mindful of the crisis, to get straight to the City Council for that to be heard. And we thought this was important, again, trying to work on that April 17th deadline as well.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Cummings.
How does this differ from what's in the current crisis declaration?
How does this version? It does not include this language.
So normally, in the previous declaration, if we wanted to establish a camp, it would have to go first to planning. or to Coastal Commission?
It really depends on the land use or type. So it depends on what's the zoning, where the property is, what it's zoned for, what's its uses, et cetera. So we would have to do that individualized assessment of the normal regulatory path for that. When we did the 1220 River Street, a permit was prepared and I believe heard by the zoning administrator. An administrative hearing by the zoning administrator. So we did issue a permit to ourselves for 1220 River Street, and it would be the same. So it's very site specific around the pathway and what would normally happen.
And under this, it would not need to go to a zoning administration or to any other
Under
commission.
this, it would come straight to this body.
Councilmember Matthews.
I had a question on the possible suspension of state or local statutes, regulations, et cetera. And it says, if they are so suspended, the government code authorizes the city to adopt substitute standards. And I just have a general question about how that might be done. And it does imply that there would be some standards.
Absolutely. And I can also talk to, in this conversation, it's interesting because sometimes we're very focused on the problem at hand, the challenge at hand, and that is moving and closing the Gateway encampment and having an alternative. But this shelter crisis declaration can also apply more broadly. So our sense of this is what we would do is if the city were to think there's a course of action where we wanted to implement this aspect or activate this aspect of it, we would look at that site and we would develop site-specific alternate health and safety codes that we feel we couldn't meet under existing, and we would bring that back to you as part of the discussion. So that's how that would work. So rather than just blanket adopting substitute standards, really weighing where we are, what's happening, what are the facilities, why do we need to have alternate public health and safety?
And somewhat related, and I spoke to you previously about this near the end, be it further resolved that in light of the homeless shelter crisis described herein, so almost the last paragraph, I think. It says, the council hereby authorizes that any permits necessary for such facilities, and then it talks about bypassing the commissions. But it's not specific that any such facility would require a permit process. And that's something I'll want to bring up in the course of, it just talks about any permits required, which implies maybe there are and maybe there aren't. So anyway, that's an issue I want to bring up later in the discussion.
Well, if there aren't any further questions at this time, does that conclude the presentation and we'll open it up to public comment?
Almost.
Okay.
Thank you. And so just in summation, what direction we would be able to move forward with is directing the city manager to implement a small-scale safe sleeping and storage program. That's the recommended program model, as Susie discussed in depth, to select a site. And we've presented 3 and done a very careful initial vetting, although, of course, more work would need to be done. And then finally, adopting the revised shelter crisis declaration. And we do feel that this action is important for at a minimum, that last component we talked about where permits would come straight to this body as opposed to going through various other levels of review, just to have us be able to move as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember.
I do have a question that I'd like for you to try to answer for the benefit of the public primarily, because we've received a lot of communications about this particular action. And I would like to just, I mean, I understand the differences between this resolution and the previous resolution that was adopted. I understand the implications. But if you could just summarize what adopting this declaration of shelter crisis would allow the city council to do that's any different from what we have been doing, I think it would be helpful, because I think that's really unclear for the public.
Okay, because we have one existing. Exactly. We do. The one that's existing does cover a lot of bases. However, it makes specific reference to where we were in our plans and projects and expectations last year. So it references like transitional encampment relative to where we were about a year ago. So that was a reason why we thought we need to generalize this instrument so it does have broader applicability if the council needs to exercise that. So that's one component. Another component, it's also, if the voice is different, it's because the voice is different. Staff wrote the initial one, and I authored that, and I based that on what was adopted in Santa Rosa. And then our city attorney drafted the revised one based upon another municipality, I believe, City of San Diego. So if you're getting a legal tone, there's a legal tone, and then there was the other tone. And another difference with this is that last element about really clarifying the pathway for permit approval and having that be coming straight to your body, and being able to still have a public hearing but move quickly. And I'll also say is that we didn't exercise the prior declaration. We had it on the books, but we found we were able to do everything within the permitting, the health and safety, the temporary use nature of it. So we didn't really flex that tool. With this, we've also had more time to really think about options and alternatives. And so we thought it would be helpful to have something that had greater clarity in areas and was more generally cast. I hope that helps. I can also pull up the old one if you'd like to see that. No? Okay.
Okay.
I just kind of wanted to get at the question of whether or not this is going to give us some sweeping new ability to establish encampments. I think that's the general concern that I'm hearing expressed, and I want to try to be clear about that.
Mm-hmm. I do not believe so, no.
I do think there might be community perception that's conflating the transitional encampment and safe parking ordinances that were tabled and the shelter declaration.
So at this time, we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. Thank you for your presentation and work and quick turnaround. I'd like to ask those who are interested in addressing the community to please raise your hands so that we have a sense of how many folks want to speak. Okay. I will go ahead and ask that you self-select to identify if you're interested in speaking for just 1 minute. If you're interested in addressing the council in just 1 minute, if you want to quickly express your opinions to us, I will go ahead and allow for you to address us first. I will then open it up to community presentation who has requested additional time, and then back to the community for a full 2 minutes. So if there's anybody who really wants to quickly, and I see somebody with a young child, please feel free. You'll be given 1 minute, and any other folks who want to address the council within the 1 minute time frame is welcome to address us first. Okay.
So right here? Hi.
Please, hi.
Hi, I just signed up my daughter for preschool. We're on High Street. I'm very nervous about what's going on. I feel a little bit better hearing some of the details like safe sleeping and not that the encampment is moving up there. I'm nervous about what could develop from safe sleeping to an encampment. I'm worried about lawlessness. I feel for the legal restraints that you guys are under, but I'm very concerned. I don't feel safe in the parks with my child. I don't feel safe in some areas. The preschool teacher told me that her car was stolen right off of High Street, that there are drug and encampment problems up there. They steal tents from them. It's a big problem. I feel for you guys. I don't know how to solve it, but I'm just saying I'm concerned and I'm worried. And these people can't protect themselves, so it's up to all of us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Melissa Freebairn, local registered nurse. I'm here to address Dr. Leff's recent comments at your last city council meeting. The public has a right to know that the city and county have been running a unsanctioned, no accountability, harm reduction, needle giveaway on the levee, needles and Narcan by non-medical personnel. And this has been happening since November, since that camp cropped up. We don't have a shelter crisis. We have a drug crisis in this town. And I am really disappointed in all of you. You've been notified. I've asked to meet with various members of this body and been denied. Yet you will sit and pander to drug addicts at Camp Ross and give them a platform to keep using drugs. And it's very upsetting that you would even open up our parks again. 2 of your sites, the only sites you can come up with are 2 parks that were destroyed. We've already been here. Camp Ross is your example of a transitional camp that's not going to work.
Okay, your time's up. Thank you. I'm going to get just 1 second. Before you begin, if you could allow the speaker who is addressing us to finish their comments, then they can have their full 1 minute. And then if you feel the need to applaud after, please do so, but allow them to speak uninterrupted. Go ahead.
Good evening. I also have a daughter in preschool on High Street, and had heard that that was potentially one of the sites, and I'm pleased to see that it's not. But as I was standing here tonight and reading lots of comments online, which is probably a very bad idea, everyone's talking about NIMBY, and I agree. And I was thinking, great, my daughter doesn't have a problem, but what about somebody else's daughter? Or what about somebody else's son? And so, given the sites that were suggested, and the council is all here, I wonder, and I'd like to hear from each of the councilors if possible, would you all agree to a pledge that whichever site that you select, you'd make sure that it's outside of some minimum distance from children under the age of high schoolers, half a mile, a quarter mile, I don't know, you guys define the distance, but you come up with some minimum distance that you say, if these are children that are under the high school age, we will guarantee that we're not going to associate this homeless problem, around children that young. Are you agreeable to that?
Go ahead. You can go ahead and pause the time. This is the chance for us to hear from you, so we'll go ahead and listen and take your input, but we're not at a position to respond at this time.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello, I'm natealex.kennedy@gmail.com, 346-9888. What I got to say is what we need is professional, legal, legitimate campgrounds with, like they put the fencing around the post office, and then they finally got real professional fences put in. We should have fences like that. We can put them in parks, Harvey West, Grant Street, San Lorenzo, but we should have a police trailer right out front that would also house a property manager that would allow people to pay rent. And we could have outdoor kitchens, we could have showers, we could have restrooms, even ones built up there so they're not just porta potties. But we got to do something, and if you're going to fail to set up legal, legitimate, professional camps, then we need to start just letting people pitch their tent right on Pacific Avenue or wherever else if we offer no alternative.
Thank you. Okay, next speaker.
Hi, my name is Carol Reed. I live downtown on Myrtle Street. I just want to say that you've selected sites. I've heard one person in here talk about public comment. I believe it was you, and maybe one other short thing. You're going through a fast process, and I'm not hearing public comment. I live downtown. My car's broken into, glasses on the street. I walk by people shooting drugs. It is a drug problem, and the whole county needs to be involved. We have sympathy, but it's a drug problem too. It's not just a homeless problem.
Hello, I'm Tamara Smith. I live near the Delaware Street area that was being considered, and that's how I got my attention. I'm not an NIMBY, though. I don't want anyone to have to deal with an ill-organized encampment that's going to impact their way of living. It's not fair for businesses, so it shouldn't be behind Camp Ross. It's not fair on natural bridges, where it's a sensitive environment, and it's not good around kids or, I would say, as the other fellow did, through high school. But they're people. I'm compassionate. Some of them have drug problems. They need drug counseling. They don't need needles. Some of them are students at the university that don't have a place to live. They need to have safe parking. Hopefully at the university would make sense. And there are just so many myriad different problems. I'd like to say that the Santa Barbara model, where I grew up, I think Santa Barbara's doing a good job. I would look at it. I'd read The Independent, and I wish you guys all the best. It's a super hard problem. We've got to do it right.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Farley, and I'm here just hopefully to sway against the East Cliff location. I think it's not a good idea. I've been living there for 22 years, right near where you cross over the bridge to the boardwalk.
Go ahead and pause it.
Talk into the microphone. Oh, thank you. And I live near the area where the boardwalk meets East Cliff, so it's kind of there. And I can't even tell you how many problems there are around the neighborhood with theft, with garbage, with walking down and being scared. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And the fact that there are so many kids in the neighborhood now, and having it be so close to that, really against it. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin Rothwell. I'm a 35-year Santa Cruz resident. I urge the city and the council to have a look at the basement of the Locust Street parking garage as a possible site for the safe sleeping site, and also a safe parking site and a storage site. It solves a lot of the problems that you've been talking about, and I think it's a suitable site. Take a look.
Steve Rohr. I was the guy that got upset last week. I was concerned about the children being exposed. So it looks like you folks have tried to mitigate that the best you could. I appreciate that. Like that little child that was brought up here, they don't have any representation. I'm not against homeless folks. I've taken them into my house. I'm not going to tell you about all the personal charitable things I've done, but my God, we've got to use common sense. Also, number two, we've got limited resources. How are we going to control the migration of people that aren't from this area coming here to have a homeless handout, needles, whatever? We've got to be able to control. If there's people in this area that have become homeless, let's help them. But my God, we can't control, people migrating from Eugene or anywhere else. So we've got to think about, limited resources. Also.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
My name's Evan Soroki. I'm in support of any and all those sites. I say yes in my backyard to any and everyone. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel, and I live off of East Cliff and help manage apartments. I'm wondering how the city is going to deal with the drug, gang, and registered sex offender problems. It's going to affect the families there even more than it does already, and how they intend to deal with the mobilization of the community in protest of it and the impact it's going to have on the Santa Cruz Boardwalk when they see what's going on in the area. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm the owner of the business that is on Washington Street, where you plan to put the sleeping area right in the back of my shop. And I'm just appalled. It's saddening. The parking lot is full every weekend from beachgoers. It's a very high-use area. There's tons and tons of apartments in city neighborhoods all around right behind me. It's unbelievable that you've chosen this spot. Please reconsider. It seems like where it used to be down behind the county courthouse made sense. All the officials in that building can look at it and see what you guys have created and keep it there until you figure it out. Please don't put it next to my business. It will destroy my shop. I will have to.
Hi, my name is Julia McDermott. I appreciate all of you for tackling this problem. I want to just put a human element on it. My son was a drug addict downtown for 12 years and would have died if a judge in this county had not gotten so sick of his vagrancy that he put him in a lockdown program with drug treatment. And that is what got him sober. He's 14 years sober today. What they're doing down on that levee, passing out needles when Emmeline is less than a 5-minute walk, where those addicts can walk over there and get medical attention and wraparound care. It is completely uncalled for. Every addict I know, and I know a lot of them from dealing with this issue, my dad was 35 years sober, numerous family members, 15, 20 years sober. Handing out needles when there are children around and you have a mixed population of drug addicts and truly homeless, struggling people, they need to be separated. Seriously.
Hello, my name is Mark, a longtime resident of Santa Cruz and homeowner parent. I have a lot to say, but only a minute. I want to go on the record that I'm opposed to everything discussed today. I can't believe what I'm hearing. I don't see any solutions, and with no disrespect. I know it's a hard job, it's a hard problem, but you're talking about what problems are we trying to solve here? Avoiding a lawsuit? It sounds like you have to have the same number of beds that you're taking away to do that, but we're talking about shelters that house maybe 50 people, but the one picture that had the number of beds was like 27. The River Street camp that we had was like half vacant. I mean, because people didn't want to share tents. Is that going to happen here? And so what problems are you solving? And it certainly isn't the problem of my children walking down the beach Sunday and wondering, well, Daddy, why is that guy laying in a pile of barf with a needle in his arm?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm a longtime resident of East Cliff area where Site 4 is. I just want to speak specifically to that area. I have no answers for homelessness, but that area, there's no parking. There's already campers on Jesse Street right there all the time. It's already a very hazardous area for pedestrians with the traffic there. As it was stated, there's no good pedestrian crossing there, as well as walking along the street as it goes along the river is very hazardous with people, bikers on that piece of sidewalk and skateboarders, and just already is a very dangerous area. So I just don't see that as a viable area. Thanks.
Good evening, City Council. My name is Curtis Relaford. I have a solution for these people. This is a bubble. Santa Cruz is a bubble. If these folks had been in the ghetto where I'm from, hey, you just got the drugs coming now. Wait till the guns come. Wait till the criminals come. It's on their way. If you don't take it from somebody who's been there, 33 years clean and sober. I know what drugs is. I know how to deal with them drug addicts. I was down there all day today preaching at them. These folks are depressed. Depression leads into destruction. And they don't care about your kids. They don't care about your business. Dude, it's enough of us in here to take one at a time under your wing, lead them to a drug center. Lead them to a facility that would take care of them. All it takes is patience.
Good evening, council members. I'm a mom. I'm a third-generation Santa Cruz resident. My daughters are fourth generation. I appreciate the common sense that's been used to not have it put up by Westlake Elementary School, where one of my daughters still goes. It's in this day and age with Megan's Law in effect in California, it doesn't make sense on having it even thought of as being so close to an elementary school where they have a pre-K to fifth grade. My other concern is the waterways. I'm a surfer. I come from a generation of Santa Cruz surfers. Having our children at the beaches with needles and whether they're loaded or not, with stepping on a needle is a huge concern for the parents in Santa Cruz who pay a lot of money for their kids to be doing junior guards and be down on the beaches, and to have the waterways possibly flood them out is not a good thing.
Hi, my name is Seth Van Horn, and I'm a father here that lives in Santa Cruz. I have a 2-year-old son. I addressed this board last year for issues in my neighborhood, and I'm back up here again because things haven't really changed. I live on 329 Spruce Street, and there is a lot of drug cartel that comes from over the hill and from the Bay Area that comes down. And the residents literally live in their cars 7 days a week, dealing drugs out of their cars. The vigilant neighbors we call all the time. The police just don't have the force to respond in time to meet them. It's just going to bring a lot more traffic. Your camp did nothing to do anything on our end of Pacific Avenue. And it's just going to bring a bigger problem to this drug cartel that's on our street. We frequent Neary Lagoon every single week with our kid, and that thing is going to get destroyed if you put a camp over near that place. What we need is to handle the drug problem and give resources for these people to clean up their lives and get off the street. Otherwise, we can't expect them to do that. We can't just give them places to live and clean needles. We need to bring a force in of money resources from the state or help from outside police force that can give us more men on the field like the FBI or something.
Hi, my name's Alicia Cole, and this is Isabella. I want to point out the fact that one thing that everybody's missing. Homeless people are people just like the rest of you. What we are is we're people without homes. We can't afford it, for whatever reasons, we have barriers. That doesn't make us immediately untrustworthy. That doesn't make us scary. That doesn't make us not worth getting paid in cash, that we suddenly need gift cards. I'm not scary to be around children. Children are not scared of being around me. We're talking about people without homes. We're not talking about scary people. And it's really depressing and disheartening to hear the way homeless people are described by some of our community. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Suzanne McLean. I'm from the Association of Faith Community. Thanks for all your hard work and deliberation on this. I think one of the points that's being missed by the community is that the idea of a safe, what are we calling it, safe sleeping or the transitional camp is not what's happened at Ross. It's going to have structure, it's going to have security, it's going to have a lot more of those things that help us to feel safe and not afraid. And I just wanted to make the point that I hear that and keep going. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Is there anybody else who'd like to address the council for 1 minute? And then we'll go ahead and have our group presentation, then reopen it up for 2 minutes. So you'll have, if you're interested in 1 minute, please feel free.
Hi, my name is Suzanne, and I live actually directly across from where the proposed site is. I'm mother of 2, and I walk to work back and forth every day. I have deep concerns about the proposed site, and I wish that you would reconsider another as well instead. I have seen, I understand, I appreciate the face of homelessness is very different, but I think it's very legitimate concerns that a lot of people have in terms of their businesses, in terms of all the different activities that would be going on. I have concerns about taking my kids out at night. I'm concerned about walking by myself as it is in that area, and I think this is just going to exacerbate all those issues a lot more, and I really, really wish that you'd reconsider church parking lots. There's lots of other options that you could use and make this a safe place, especially for families that are homeless, because I realize that's one of the most outstanding issues. So, thank you.
Hi, City Council. I think about this problem a lot, too. I'm over on the East Cliff Way. I've rented apartments. 2 of my 26 apartments I've rented to homeless people that were good people. One of them lived in the woods far out Highway 9 when it ended because he was afraid to live in the homeless camp. He said he couldn't even sleep in the rain with a tent for fear that somebody would beat him up and take his stuff. And I couldn't bear that. I gave him a place. He's a great worker, a great person. There are good homeless people. But I can tell you on East Cliff, there's needles on the street. My husband goes along and cleans them up. He got pricked by the needle. He had to take terrible shots for a year to make sure he didn't have anything bad. And the community there has more taken over and taken the community back from the drug users. They'll tell drug users to move on. We've got more people with the houses with single family homes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
For one.
I have several things to say. First of all, we're dealing with 3 different crises here: a mental health services crisis, a drug addiction crisis, and an affordable housing homeless crisis. And as long as you're lumping all those people together, no matter what you try to do, it will fail. And that I also think what a great working model would be set up much like the state parks, where people are on a sliding scale pay. If they're on disability, they pay a little bit. If they're not, they can work a few hours. But where they can come and go and feel like they have a place, maybe even their lot space is their address, so they can apply for a job. But as long as we're treating everybody, because I suffer from chronic homelessness, I brought my children here. They were born in Santa Cruz, and I don't have any criminal history. I don't do any drugs. So we really need to see some supportive services. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jeffrey Stonehill, and just wanted to say I got here in 1970. Very briefly, living in the Dakota apartments across from San Lorenzo Park. It was a monster up until a few months ago. People yelling all night long, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. You wouldn't know about cars coming up at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, going to the park, slamming their doors, shouting loudly, getting back in their cars. Skateboards coming down at 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning to do whatever business they have in the park. Several tents with over 40 bicycles doing bicycle business in the park. People screaming all night, I love heroin. People defecating right in the middle of the park. I'm asking, why don't you put the garbage in a can? It's 1 foot from you. It's my park, it's my land, I can do whatever I want. People screaming and yelling all night long. Most of the people there are in their 70s and 80s. A poor situation. But anyhow, I wish you luck on all this. Yeah.
Good evening. I'll try and make my comments brief. My name is Bradley Olin. I'm a parent of 2 young daughters. I live on the Upper West Side, and I believe that there's a disconnect happening with respect to the conversation about safe sleeping spaces. I think the public, at least in this room and the community we know, doesn't fully understand the ramifications of that kind of arrangement versus what's going on at Camp Ross. And I think there needs to be a broader education that happens where we understand what's going on and how these camps will be run. Because let's face it, those 3 sites that are left are all next to public spaces where children play. And yeah, maybe they're not playing at 9 o'clock at night, but right now, from what I've heard, I don't know how those overnight camps are going to be run. All I've got in my head is Camp Ross. And so even if you say it's going to be regulated, we don't know what that means as the public, and we're all really spooked about it. So I think if you're going to propose park sites and you're going to put it where there are lots of kids and families around, you've got to bring us all into the fold and get us on board by helping us be comfortable with the safety. Thanks.
Mike Timpanaro, Prada. I live in the West Side. I know Portland has kind of an interesting program to help with the homelessness. They have an incentive program for homeowners to put additional dwelling units on their property. And if you offered something like that, I'd certainly consider it to help solve the problem. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. So we'll go ahead and have our presentation from Santa Cruz neighbors. I'll go ahead and. Are we still up for 1 minute? Is anybody still up for 1 minute? Okay. Presentation from Santa Cruz neighbors. If not, okay, go ahead for 1 minute.
Hi, my name is Sunny, and I sleep in that encampment. I just helped a female elder who didn't have no place but got kicked out. And I had a bed right next to me. I opened it out. I loaned it out. And she was safe with her dog as well. I cleaned up the encampment around my areas, including some other tents that I sleep right next to. I do the work wherever I go on riding the bike. I'm picking up the needles on these bike trails. And all these little complaints with these bikers, they're not stopping to pick up those needles with their safety. I'm hearing complaints, but they're not doing anything by their mouths. Put your mouths over there and help us out. Clean up the campment. If you want to volunteer, please. We need a little bit of help because some people don't know how to get up. And about a drug issue, every city is a drug issue.
So I believe that concludes the folks that are interested in 1 minute. We'll go ahead and have the presentation that requested additional time. I'll go ahead and invite Deb Elston up to go ahead and present at this time. And you'll have 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Watkins, council members, staff, and to the neighbors for writing the emails and showing up. I could probably talk an hour up here, but I'll keep it to my time. When you hear about an idea, you need to ask yourself, does this continue to enable those on the street, or does it truly help them make the changes in their life's situation? As you are taking action to help those that are homeless in our community, I believe with a strong county partnership, we will be able to help those who want help. The city doesn't have to do this alone. Let's not confuse ourselves on addiction or homelessness. Neighbors throughout the city have been completely left out of your initial deliberations. Some council members have been to neighborhood meetings, most have not. Neighbors must be at the table. They have ideas. You absolutely need to listen to neighbors before you bring proposals forward. It may take more time in the beginning, but this has proven to be more beneficial than getting the backlash of reactions that you have created. Neighbors throughout the city are truly frustrated with your current chaotic process. You cannot use programs that continue to enable destructive behaviors and hurt the people in need as much as the community around them. There needs to be accountability on all sides, people who need help and those people who are trying to help. Our community cannot be drugged down to lower standards. We already have neighbors moving, businesses closing over this issue. Policies that don't cost anything need to be put in place to help set expectations in our community and responsibilities on all sides. Santa Cruz Neighbors throughout the 18 years has been engaged in countywide partnerships, executive boards, networks, and discussing this extremely complex homeless issue in our community. This is not my first rodeo here. Personally, after the past 10 years of homeless research, befriending homeless, and looking for solutions, I've even advocated for individuals getting the help they need. I went back to look at Dr. Robert Marbut, who is a homeless advocate, an expert that consults with communities nationwide. His guiding principles are: 1, move to a culture of transformation. 2, co-locate and virtual e-integration as many of the services possible. 3, you must have a master case management system. 4, reward positive behavior. 5, consequences for negative behavior. 6, external activities must be redirected or stopped. 7, panhandling enables homeless and must be stopped. Many of these policies are started and need to continue. Maybe we should adopt a policy of compassion. This policy needs to include everyone in our community: families raising children, businesses that contribute to our economic stability, our community wanting safety, and a thriving quality of life, and yes, our homeless bettering their own lives. This policy of compassion, I'm almost done.
You can go ahead. I keep it pretty consistent with the time. You're welcome to submit your comments, and we'll go ahead and
last
have
sentence.
I can't. I'm sorry. I'm very consistent with that for everybody. I wish I could, but I want to make sure that there's really an equity of voice. So I'm pretty consistent on that standard. So we'll go ahead and submit that, and we'll read that. Okay. Thank you. So at this time, we'll go ahead and open it up to any member of the public who would like to address the council for 2 minutes. Okay.
Hello, I'm Mark Gutierrez from the De La Viega neighborhood. First off, I think this council is full of people who are compassionate and are really trying to find a solution to a problem. I think the issue is that right now there's some conflation between solution.
Go ahead and pause it. We'll go ahead and pause and just
Sure.
make sure that you have your time in Zoom.
So I think there's an issue in that there's a conflation between solution and action. I think that some of these proposals that are made by some on the council are definitely actions, but I don't know if they're solutions. In particular, I think these actions also have a cost associated with them. Despite the assurances from this council, anytime any government body issues emergency declaration to bypass any of the procedures or proposals that are in place to safeguard individuals and shift power from people to government, it causes people to worry. In addition, I think that there's some conflation about the populations of the homeless. I think on one hand, there's a population of individuals who have a hard time making ends meet, who might be the working poor, who just need a hand up to be able to improve their lives, and they have a desire to do so. The other population is the population as described by the doctor from last city council meeting, or through addiction or through some other issue are not quite at that point in life where they're willing to make that change. I wonder about some of the programs or proposals offered by the city council and which of those population is being helped. And so I ask the city council, before you vote on anything, to please consider, am I voting for actions or am I voting for solutions? Am I voting for a policy that actually empowers people or hinders that? Or am I voting for a solution that just creates space for people to exist or actually help them to improve their lives? Thank you.
I'd like to invite the next speaker. And just so you know, you'll have 2 minutes.
Good evening to the City Council. I'm Howard Nelson, 35-year resident and voter of Santa Cruz. I want to bring to your attention and submit for the record a document from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness from May 2018. I don't know if it's in the record. I sent it as an email attachment, but I don't know if you enter, open attachments. This addresses many of the proposed solutions that we're talking about tonight and says that while they're well-intentioned and compassionate, they may be misdirected and have unintended consequences. They say creating sanctioned encampments and safe zones or other similar settings have proven to have little impact on chronic homelessness. You need to have stable places they can live with support. Creating safe zone environments are costly in money, personnel, and effort, and it's better spent on permanent housing and support. And safe zones are difficult to manage and maintain. Upkeep, security, sanitation are all needed on a continuous basis. What they do say is if you decide to proceed with this, these temporary safe zones, once established, you got to know they're going to be difficult to close. They should be a plan for how these people are only temporary and they're moved on to permanent housing and other supports. You need to regularly access your outcomes. Are you improving things? And they say to contact the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, any city or county agency. They'll give you help. They're there. And I'd like to just submit this for the record.
Yeah. I'd like to invite the next speaker.
Hello, thank you, council members. My name is Amy. I'm a West Side homeowner and parent. As a parent, I share a lot of the same fears as other parents who have kids running around downtown and on the beaches. And at the same time, I was here when the first, I believe, sleeping ban, and I can't remember if it was a sitting ban, happened. And I remember thinking, where are these people going to go? They got to go somewhere. I mean, are we going to push them off of Westcliff? What is going to happen to people? So what I appreciate here is I understand that this is a temporary solution to try to move the people at the Ross camp to some place that has more supervision, more services, more control, and to be able to provide services to people in a more organized fashion, let's say. And I really support that. I don't support closing the Ross camp without an alternative for these people to go to. And when I see the Ross camp, I'm both saddened and I also feel like there's some community there for people. I think that when people want to get off drugs, it's very difficult for them to try to get on their feet when they're constantly having to look for shelter, clothing, protection, food. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are so basic that you need to have, even if it's in jail, in order to start to get off drugs too. And I understand that most of the people there actually don't know what the population there is. I did send an email to the council saying, I think we need to do more canvassing of that population to ask who's ready to move to transitional shelter, who's using drugs and alcohol and wants to get off, who's using drugs and alcohol and doesn't want to get off, so that we know who this population is and what they specifically need. And that will tell us how many people can go into this safe sleeping environment. And I'm also concerned about the safe sleeping environment because during the day, where do people go? I mean, I get to go home and take a nap when I'm tired. So that'll end you can check my email.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith McHenry, and I've been sharing food with people on the streets for 39 years and have family members homeless. I'm somewhat familiar with the issue. I do appreciate what some of the people were saying about bringing the neighbors to actually create the structure for each of these transition camps. I think that's very valuable. It would be, it's crazy just to put camps in a neighborhood where people have no input into how they're organized. But at the same time, I support these 3 staff recommendations basically, but we must look also at the fact that the number of people forced to live on the streets is increasing dramatically month by month. And if something goes awry with the Trump economics, dream or whatever the heck it is that he's trying to put on everybody, we could see 3 or 4 times more homeless people on our streets than we are now within the time before Mayor Watkins has become the next vice mayor, whatever it is that happens to you when you no longer a mayor. And so we have to kind of like focus on this thing. So I used to get like 3 or 4 people a month maybe tell me they just became homeless, where's the shelter? It went to 6 people a month at the beginning of the month asking where the shelter is, or 6 families. Now it's like that. At the beginning of the month, they tell you about how they lost their car, got towed by the police. They now live on the streets. Many of them are women in their like 40s, 50s, and 60s. We had a family that just came to us because their car was stolen on vacation here, and now they're homeless and have no possible way to get off the street here. They can't reach their family to get money to get back. Can't hook her up with Chris to get a free bus ticket yet because she's out of commission currently. And that we need to really get solutions. Thank you.
Some of you know me. I am Richard Lewis. Collaboration and partnership are words. Our United Way CEO speaks of, instead of giving money to the nonprofit network, of coming to Santa Cruz with action. So I coach you to be in dialogue to see just what that means here in Santa Cruz. The Barlin Bailey Circus was coming to our county and our city. Those of you who haven't researched Carry the Vision, carrythevision.org, I propose collectively Carry the Vision / Santa Cruz with the leader over the hill, where the county of over there worked with SEIU, created land. SEIU had tents in their parking lot. They worked together. So Carry the Vision by design could be like Women Rise for Peace. As you remember, Women Rise for the Homeless. Create the kind of initiative where we begin to listen. The power isn't in talking heads. The power is in the people who come here week in, week out. And not only parents, but nonprofits. And I'll be sharing with some of you new collaboration software coming out by the bad guys, Facebook, where you can begin to have your passion come together with the people who, building bridges, 15 million. So I'm homeless. 82 years old, but I'm happy. I appreciate all of you. I don't know if anybody knows the work that people are putting on just to sit there. And if you ask your dad, who is Richard, I'm on the right table. I want to leave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Hello, Carol Paul Hamus again. How are you? I was a school teacher and school administrator for 35 years, so school safety for me is paramount to almost anything else. And I especially want to thank Mayor Watkins' last meeting and Vice Mayor Cummings for mentioning school safety because it's really critical. So I'm kind of a numbers girl, and I had a lot of time on my hands. So by 4 o'clock, there were 964 public correspondence pages submitted to you guys. I'm sure you didn't have a chance to read them all. They were pretty hefty. Out of the 964, 2 people were neutral, 7 were pro, and 955 were opposed, primarily to the transitional neighborhood camping, which I'm really thrilled to hear is being tabled for the moment. I tried to summarize, because I did read a lot of the letters, what the worries were. And a lot of them were about suspending the rules around environment, community, schools, et cetera, that a declaration of shelter crisis emergency would permit. So many of the letters called to amend the shelter declaration to say that there be some kind of a buffer zone around childcare, schools, for school safety purposes, and that there not be any transitional camps permitted on parks, beaches, and public streets without public review, which would allow the community to express and, talk about their concerns. So I wanted to bring that forth. I want to thank you for your work on this, and see you next time.
Hi, I'm Garrett. The essence of what I wanted to say is that more services will always equal more homeless. This is a dumping ground for the county's homeless. We have all the services here. That's why they're here. They come for the services, they anchor to the services, and they're not going anywhere. You add more services, it might help with some people, but others will take their place. And anyway, I wanted to read this. Using the 2017 annual homeless assessment report to Congress, Santa Cruz has 650% more homeless, 470% more shelter than our share of California's homeless and shelter averages by population. The city of Santa Cruz hosts almost all the county, state, and federal social services for the homeless in the county, save for very few in Watsonville. Add in the 40-plus NGOs, many on the government take, providing services, plenty of Mexican heroin and meth, a culture and official sanction of tolerance, aka lack of morals, enforcement of law, too brief revolving door of justice. And here we are, flooded to the public breaking point with homeless, heroin, meth addiction, crime, safety, health, and blight issues. Criminal homeless need to be given the choice of jail or jail with treatment, release, and probationary supervision. It's a drug and mental health problem mostly, a too many just here problem that the rest of the citizen contributors don't deserve in these numbers. How many homeless services are in the Aptos, Capitola, Socotel, Scotts Valley? 0. How many homeless? 40. No one even bothered to count in Soquel or Aptos. It would be a waste of time. Any adding of homeless services invites and anchors more homeless here. It is the major cause of the concentration created over time by the government of the extreme too many homeless problems. Every next homeless service added should be outside the city limits, no exceptions, including the NGOs who come begging for funds to provide yet more service.
Thank you. And please, if you want, you can leave your
Hi, council members. I'm Paul Hodge. I'm a 40-year resident of Santa Cruz and a landowner. I think I have a concern about the location of the camp. I know we've got to do the camp, and I know it's temporary, but I have a concern about the location of the camp, of the sleeping camps in a residential area where people are also sleeping. I like the idea of a camp in an area where people are not sleeping or residing near that camp at the same hours that the camp is active. So that's something to think about. I also like the temporary nature of it, that you're putting a 6 months on it, and I think it'd be good if you consider making it mandatory that you review it at the 6 months, not just automatically roll it over. That way you could look at any issues or bugs in the system. And finally, it would be good if once the camp is established, that there would be able to be some kind of a triage, people that could go in and work with the people that have a drug addiction problem, which is not a crime, it's an addiction problem, and work with the families and the individuals that can't afford the housing and help them get into some kind of housing programs so that there'd be some more one-on-one inside the camp. And I commend you for taking on such a big problem, because maybe we could be exemplary for the rest of the country in how we deal with our homeless crisis, because we're not the only ones. So thank you.
Susan Worth, SoCal. Well, I'm going to be 70 April 3rd, matter of days, and I too would be homeless if my dad hadn't died and helped me with a trust. I live in a trailer in SoCal, and it's a 1972 trailer. Parts of it are biodegrading rather quickly and flooding underneath and some other problems, dry rot. But at least I'm surviving. And it's because I was a waitress for almost 20 years. A lot of these people were waitresses. I made $2 an hour. That went into my Social Security. That's why it's so low. And it gave me an interesting attitude about men. But nonetheless, here I am. And I went to Penny U. I go to Penny U a lot on Monday with Paul Lee, who's 92 years old. And he is one of the people that set up the Pogo Nip. What is it, 640 acres, something like that. Anyway, a lot of acres. I'm bad with numbers. He set up the Pogo Nip. 40 years ago, it celebrated its 40th anniversary just recently. And he says we need to build some permanent housing right in the Pogo Nip. That's what he says, for people. He cares about people. A lot of people in this community do. We can't keep just pushing these people around and making them feel like crap. They're already so depressed, just like Curtis said. I overheard him talking as I came up. These people are depressed. They've got issues. We need to help them in every way we possibly can. Please, now. Thank you.
City Council, my name is Pedro Castillo. I live on Felker Street. I just want to thank you for the help you guys have given us for our neighborhood. And also I just want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. I know there's a real hard issue. There's a lot of people coming and coming. Move and comment, don't move and comment. It's all this going back and forth. I just hope that you guys do the best decision. And I know it's a complex issue, and then it's hard to find a model that can work for everything. Last Sunday, the Santa Cruz neighbors sent out an email of a report that was done in homeless in Seattle. And then, it was devastating to see the problem they have there. But also in the report, it showed a model that Rhode Island is doing. Some people mentioned about the medication treatment. So I think that there are other things that can be looked at. So I was going to encourage you and thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Marina Iyer, and I have two things. I would love for our city council to have a long-term goal, a 10-year goal of how are we going to get permanent housing for these people in need. Maybe a goal of 100 permanent subsidized housing with facilities, things available to them that we can slowly work on the homelessness problem. I feel like right now we are enabling drugs and we are just adding to the drug problem. We're giving needles, we're not giving housing. And right now, Santa Cruz, I was looking it up, in one of the lists as of late, Santa Cruz is listed as the 22nd most dangerous city in California. Can we please make it a goal of our city council to make it one of the top 20 safest cities in California? It's such a wonderful city with so much heart, and also to be a forerunner of caring for those in need instead of being a drug zone and asking for and just making it so easy for transients to come here to enable this drug addiction that oftentimes leads to death. I understand there were 3 deaths in the camp. I'm not sure how they were caused, but if they were caused by overdose, I don't know. But if the city is handing out these needles, is the city going to start to be liable for this? Or if children are stepping on needles that the city's handing out and they are sick, is the city going to be liable? We're talking about all the liability and rights of these homeless, but what about our citizens and keeping them safe? My car was broken into last week. My carport had $1,500 of things stolen. The person who stole it, the perpetrator, stole our neighbor's car. He was found a week later, strung out, passed out in front of, sorry, I can't finish, but.
You're welcome. If you have comments, you're welcome to leave them if you like. Okay.
The drug exchange program with the needles is saving lives, period. Don't flood the neighborhoods. Retain the Ross camp. Lynn Renshaw has proposed a solution in a generic email returned by many critics of the Ross camp. In it, she suggests the city meet the minimum, come on. Any person, if they're left out in the cold, then it's a failure program. You have to give shelter to everyone. If one person, who would it be? How are you going to change it? Take the time to team with the county to use the $10 million, the heap of money grant, and encourage the county to do their fair share. She, in the form letter she generated, proposes amending the proposal so that shelters cannot be placed in parks, beaches, streets, and sidewalks without first requiring public and environmental review. And how much are these permits going to cost? So that the public exemptions will require fully maintained, professionally staffed, and secure shelter facilities. Perhaps so, but where will the folks that are shelterless be if they're driven out from the Ross camp? Which ones are going to survive and which ones are going to die?
And you're welcome if you'd like to leave your comments.
Good evening, Council. I'm Greg Bengtson. I'm a registered voter, resident of Santa Cruz, and my home's in the Ross camp, and I live in Reality, which is a place that people ought to visit occasionally. And I do understand all sides of this 20-sided coin, and it's not a pretty situation, but again, it's reality. And I do appreciate, I had some other things to say, but I spoke with Fire Chief Hyduk, and reality happens, people are human. I appreciate what first responders, police, I appreciate when city staff comes out, meets with us, city council members that I've talked to and those who I haven't. This is not easy, but we're not going to go away too quickly, unfortunately. it's an existential thing. We're not here just to have a place to rest, a place to sleep. We want to live and perhaps even eventually thrive, and self-actualize. And yeah, man, work. I've worked lots all over the world, and but right now, I'm in Santa Cruz, and I would have just left, but when we're told to leave somewhere, I'm going to stick around and show what we do, those of us who have skills. But I do appreciate everything. Also, I want to say, hey, clean needles, save lives, but heroin sucks. Heroin sucks. Bye.
I did on that last remark. I've spent a lot of time reading about this issue. Oh, thank you. I spent a lot of time reading about this issue because I just wanted to educate myself. I was starting to feel guilty about the whole thing. Here I am saying we should make these changes to better me, but I want to better everybody. So I kind of went through lots of articles and lots of videos, and one of the biggest takeaways that I got on it was that it's not simply a homeless problem, it's a chronically homeless problem. And almost everything that I read about, it has to do with drug addiction. Those are the people that are chronically homeless for the most part. And unless we get them help, this isn't going to change. So, and I don't think we're ever going to fix the problem. I think it can be managed, but I don't think we'll ever get rid of it completely. So my proposal is, since you guys always want solutions, reopen bench lands so you can have everybody in one spot. Secondly is to think long-term. And one place, I forget where it was, they actually had a lockdown facility for drug addicts that helped to get them clean, monitored them when they got out, helped them, achieve success in life. And otherwise they have to go to jail. And then the third thing is to give the police the ability to enforce the laws, because right now they're not enforcing the laws. So we don't feel safe. If they were out there patrolling and doing their jobs, we would feel safer, but they can't. Their hands are tied because you're telling them not to arrest people. Don't even bother citing them because they just rip it up. Also, let's see. The site you have on Washington is directly adjacent to the soccer field, just so you know, lots of kids. And one more thing, please stop freaking us out with your ill-conceived ideas because it stresses everybody I know out, including myself. Thank you.
Next speaker.
Good evening, Council. Elise Casby. I've spent the last 10 solid years investigating homeless in all different cities and different places. I want to say, please go forward with these very moderate solutions that serve to assist poor people in our community. Homeless people are poor people who lack housing and have little money to pay for housing. I am extremely dismayed and discouraged by the neighbors' descriptions of homeless people because these are lurid descriptions, mean descriptions, and yes, bigoted descriptions. But most of all, they are uninformed descriptions. These people with their lurid descriptions, their bigoted and uninformed descriptions, are all self-described experts. Yes, do they know that 9% of the homeless people, according to Wikipedia several years ago, are victims of domestic violence, and that there are virtually no available transitional shelters for these women? If these people are so full of compassion, why have they not cared enough to build low-income housing for the 70% of Santa Cruz residents who are born here and or grew up here, who became homeless here because of escalating rents, lack of affordable housing, and low-income housing? These figures are from the September 2014 Association of Communities and Smart Solutions Conference, county and city officials, Don Lane, and many other homeless advocates. Please check the 2014-2015 grand jury final report, recipe for failure, et cetera, et cetera. If these people who care so much with their hate-filled descriptions of people experiencing homeless, why for the past 30 years have these same peoples, these neighbors, not cared more about massive war budgets, increasing weapons trades around the world in the millions, and the creation of cluster bombs that children pick up because they look like toys, I have heard, a fraction of which could go into solving our homeless and mental health issues. These neighbors are not caring. These neighbors have come out in force tonight because they are bigoted and they want to make sure that we keep the status quo.
I'll go ahead and remind the community that as everybody speaks, they have their time without interruption. Go ahead, you'll have 2 minutes.
I appreciate one of the previous speakers' comments about lumping the many and varied problems being experienced by our homeless population altogether. Every one of those people has a story, and not knowing the details is what prevents us from helping them address their particular challenges. Unfortunately, Council's recent focus on enacting emergency declarations sought in order to speed through policy changes that avoid public review and the typical vetting that occurs under established procedures is troubling. The idea that housing, mental health, and addiction challenges are actually emergent by any definition ignores the past 4 decades of questionable decision-making here in our community. Having said that, I think most reasonable people would agree that for those individuals struggling to be housed, circumstances in Santa Cruz could hardly be worse. And while these individuals are struggling, so too are the vast majority of our community population that has to live with the constant theft, disoriented behavior, environmental degradation, disease vectors, and occasional violence, not to mention the not inconsiderable cost of hosting, maintaining, protecting, and supervising the housing challenged. In my opinion, shelters, safe sleeping sites, and/or encampments should never be seen as an acceptable end state, no matter the circumstances of those who occupy them. They should similarly never be self-governing nor anonymous. They should be focused on triage only, and our efforts as a community should be focused on what comes after the shelter, and that means more permanent housing, lots of it, and many different types, including supportive communities and means-tested, deed-restricted homes. We all need to be clear this problem is decades old and will not be solved quickly. We shouldn't be trying to enact ill-conceived solutions based on a loosely defined set of objectives. Let's make shelters of any kind unnecessary. Thank you.
Josh Stevens here. I am just here to say, whatever you guys do, you gotta act fast, because this problem's just getting out of hand. And I'm not even talking about the campsites. I'm not even talking about like all these issues that everyone else is talking about. I'm talking about the basic fact that is housing. It's housing. It's the huge equation of this problem here. And like, for example, one of my neighbors, they basically have to decide, oh, what bill do we pay? Do we scrap together this month? What bill do we scrap together next month? And it's just like that paycheck to paycheck life. And then boom, one of the housemates gets out on disability because, and then all of a sudden it's a struggle here. It's a struggle to make it out here. And just don't lose focus of that matter. In fact, I understand that that is the platform in which some of our city leaders have ran on. So I look forward to seeing what gets done in that regards. And I really hope that something gets done before we lose community, because that's the main part of this all, why we're here today, to build our community. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kenny. I was thinking about shelter. When I think of shelter, I mean, got a roof over the top. And so after the earthquake, the city of Santa Cruz put up tents, and I think they were in the parking lots. And so my thought would be like the Kaiser Arena, that structure. If we made some small ones, you could put them in a parking lot. Like at Front and Laurel, it would look just like the arena. How many people? It'd be about the size of this building. You could get 30, 40 people in there to sleep. Now, I know a lot of people don't want government to get in their face. So we got $10 million to use. We could experiment with some kind of structure where they don't have to sleep in a tent. The other part is I've gone into those bathrooms, and they got the little urinal right here, and then the lady's got to sit right next to that thing. Why don't we build a building where people could go in and not look at what is in there. You know, we could help them out. I don't think you guys can do it right away, but I think we would look at actually getting a building. Now, that might bring more people in, so be it. Yeah. Hey, thanks for listening to me. I appreciate it.
I'd like to get a sense of how many more members of the community would like to address us on this issue. Okay. Okay, so you'll be our last speaker. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, City Council, for your time and attention to this. My name is Mike Iyer. I've been here in Santa Cruz for about 10 years. We came to Santa Cruz because we love everything about Santa Cruz, obviously, like most of us, the ocean, the mountains, the community. And I have a lot of compassion for solving this issue, and it's a difficult one that we're not going to solve tonight, obviously. I just want to point out, as several other people have pointed out, that I feel like it's really difficult to attack the homelessness because, as we all know, and I'm not putting everyone into this group, I promise. I know that every story is different, but there is a lot of drug use. I think that we can all agree to that. And I think that we also typically say illegal drug use or illegal drugs, and I have a difficult time explaining to my children why drugs are illegal, but then they're not illegal, I guess. Or, I mean, they're confused because we don't enforce illegal drug use. And I feel like until we tackle that problem, we're not going to be in a position to tackle the homeless problem, because if we build a lot more homeless camps, I think that we all understand that there's a lot of people that will come to this area because it's a great area, and we have lax policies on drug use, and we'll get a lot of people that will come to this area that'll be drug users. And so if we can't crack down on enforcing drug use, illegal drug use, I remind you, I don't know how we can attack this problem of homelessness. We're just going to perpetuate it, in my opinion. I'd love to see us do everything we can to continue to make the city great, and I really want us to find a solution that works for everyone, but I also just really want us to focus on the component of this. I know it's just a portion, a percentage of it, but that is illegal drug use, and really think about if we can put attention there and efforts there to make this a central part of this discussion. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ross Newport. I know quite a few of you actually. I work at Community Printers. I work over at Community Printers. We've had a lot of homeless people hanging out around the shop. 2 weeks ago, a guy came in at 7 o'clock into the back room of the shop and stole my $3,000 bike. 2 years ago, I went into the hospital, got really sick, was told I had to change my life. I got that bike, and I've loved it. Every day I've ridden that bike, I've started to get better from having it. There were security camera footage, so I was able to see pictures of the person who stole it, went on to Mugshot Santa Cruz, identified who the guy was, talked to the police about it, and they're pursuing him right now, but was able to determine that he's cited a lot at the homeless camp by Ross. I printed up a flyer, $500 reward for my bike, and started walking around the camp. You walk around with a flyer for a $500 reward, you get a lot of attention there. So I talked to a lot of people. I went around and realized that not only is the guy who stole my bike living there, but that there's multiple chop shops that are there. Multiple people running criminal enterprises on a site that is essentially sanctioned by the city.
Okay, go ahead.
I ended up finding the guy.
Okay, go ahead and continue. Without interruption. Go ahead.
Right. I ended up finding the guy at the camp wearing my jacket. I confronted him about it. He took off the jacket, gave it back to me, told me that in order to get my bike back, he needed $60. I said there was no way I was getting the $60 to get my bike. He walked back into the camp, over to the area where the chop shops are, which is in the far end, kind of by the River Street and Freeway intersection, and came back about 10 minutes later.
Your time is up. Your time is up. Okay, and you're welcome to email the council. Yeah, well, yes, thank you. And your time is up now. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker.
evening. Congratulations on your seat. I wanted to be a California State Assemblywoman back when I was 30 years old, but CPS made sure that my family was destroyed, and there's a lot of children coming out of foster care that are homeless. But what this gentleman said back here, drug addiction and alcoholism doesn't run just in the homeless community. It runs in the rich families as well as middle class and poor families. So it's a problem, and it's a problem everywhere. I was listening to KSCO radio, and there was a gentleman on by the name of Steve Pallage or something. He mentioned that this county got $10 million. Okay. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And it should not just go into your salaries and pocketbooks, and the pocketbooks, the salaries of the mental health building, as well as the homeless shelters to pay them. That's enough money where this county could find a building. There's so many. Do you know how many buildings out here are empty because businesses have left and closed down? And I do food delivery for a living. So as I drive around the city, I see all these empty buildings. And so I don't understand why y'all can't try to find a building to use it for the homeless. And the other thing I wanted to mention was, so as I drive around and do my food delivery business, I've been noticing the Santa Cruz police and the Santa Cruz sheriffs harassing and giving the homeless people tickets. Now, they know darn well that they can't pay these tickets, and they'll eventually end up in jail.
Your time is up.
And
okay.
so, they do that so they can get paid.
Your time is up. Your next speaker. We're going to go ahead and have the two folks here in the front, and then one more speaker, and those will be our last three speakers. So after you, go ahead.
Mayor Watkins, council members, I'm Maggie Ivey. My heart is really breaking for this community. I've lived here for about 24 years. It's a good-hearted, compassionate community. It's a difficult conversation. A speaker earlier urged you to vote for solutions, but I think it's really hard to vote for a solution when we don't agree on the problem or really even acknowledge the problem. It seems that we're conflating different issues. We have a housing issue, absolutely, no argument about that. But the Ross Camp is not a housing issue. The Ross Camp is a symptom of a pervasive and chronic drug problem in our community. And we've all watched it grow over the years, and it's a sad situation. It's a disease addiction, and like many of you in my family, we've experienced that. But in this community, I think there's a fine line between compassion and enabling, and we have to be really careful about how we move forward. We need our leaders to acknowledge what the problem is. And I wish so much tonight that instead of looking at adopting a revised shelter crisis declaration, we were talking about a drug crisis declaration. I, last night, spent my evening watching Seattle is Dying, and I cried because that's where our community is going. Perhaps we're already there. But if we can't agree on what the problem is, we cannot solve it with compassion. Thank you.
Okay. Are you okay? All right. So then the following four are our last speakers. Go ahead.
I'm not sure. I mean, I've heard this kind of circling around areas as a consideration, but I was wondering about Pogonip as a possible place to have a camp. And I guess I see that sort of from the camps that I've seen, kind of the benchlands, and then, Ross Camp right now. It's kind of hard in sort of those transient areas to actually establish a community, which might actually be a bit at the core of a lot of these issues. I cannot call myself a drug addict, but I can only imagine if you don't feel you're part of a community, there's not really going to be a lot of a takeoff point for that. And Pogonip is a beautiful place, and I think the more people sort of participate beyond, I guess, like the churches bringing food and amenities and that sort of thing, we could also make sure that there's efforts to do as much cleanup as possible, because if I've hope in anything about Santa Cruz, it's the ability to get people to volunteer out of the spirit of keeping Santa Cruz green. Definitely kind of seems like the spirit of the city. So that's, yeah, I don't know. I guess I have 45 seconds, but that's pretty much it.
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm wondering how many people, I just got here, so I haven't heard a lot what was said, but I'm wondering how many people that wish the Ross camp would go away have actually spent time at the camp. I actually just came from the camp. I didn't realize this would still be going, otherwise I would have come here to make sure that none of the tents have been moved or taken down, because I heard that there's been signs put on some of the tents. So I spent a lot of time there over this weekend. I was there Saturday and Sunday. I am willing to sleep there. I go there alone. I went there at night on Sunday night. I don't feel afraid. I think there's a whole fear mongrel. I wish you could all go there and see. It was so peaceful, so quiet on Saturday, Sunday. Yes, there's drug use. I doubt it if it's more than 50%. I think Dr. Leff said it was less than 50%. I'm wondering, well, let me just put it this way. If I was out there for more than a week, I would definitely have heroin as my drug of choice. And the way the people treat the people that are in the camp, I would either go insane or probably take heroin. So the thing is, the compassion is bullshit. You want to kick them out of the camp, but yet you don't want them anywhere. So you want them to disappear? That's exactly what, and you heard a yes there. So that's not going to happen. That's really not going to happen. So we need some solutions. We need low barrier and we need high barrier. We need all types of solutions. Oh, I can speak longer because Martina's in here. I can get in my whole sentence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Scott Graham, and I believe you should adopt the revised shelter crisis declaration. There's a lot of people out there that don't understand what you're doing with that and don't realize that the one that's already in place gives you the same powers they're afraid this new one's going to give you. So I don't see any reason why not adopt this, because it clears up some of the language that the other one had kind of muddied. If you look at the fourth whereas in that resolution, where it talks about the people that are affected by homelessness, the children, adolescents, elderly, and disabled people, that's a national disgrace. It doesn't just happen here in Santa Cruz, it's happening nationwide. And it's a national disgrace that we have elderly people, we have handicapped people, we have children, we have adolescents that are homeless in this country. We're the most powerful, richest country in the world, and we can't even take care of the people that are here. It's a disgrace. So we need to do something, and if passing this resolution will be a first step, I think you need to do that. Secondly, I think that you need to look closely at programs in the past, do a cost-benefit analysis to see where money is best spent, where it actually gets to the people that need the help instead of being eaten up by administration cost, overhead cost, faculty, facility cost, all that kind of stuff. where the money really gets to the people and can be put to best use. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And Mr. Dorst, you'll be our last speaker. Go ahead.
Anybody else want to speak? Okay. Okay, we've had a lot of organized NIMBYism, drug war hysteria, needle mania, and then fantasies of housing. What we really have is a permanent reality of homelessness. Now, what have we got here? We have an alternate shelter pilot program. In order for the Ross Camp to close or be significantly reduced, because that's what this is really all about, get rid of that Ross Camp. That's the answer, you see, that everyone is here for and that this council is playing with. And that is an important consideration. That is to say, the Ross Camp really is an important place for people. It's an emergency survival shelter encampment that was encouraged by police, rangers, and social services. The staff's pilot program is far too small and limited. It doesn't deal with the people that are going to be in the Ross Camp, much less the broader homeless population. Even with the Laurel Street shelter, the 7th Avenue shelter, the 1220 Barbed Wire Boneyard River Street shelter reopened, and the 50-person safe sleeping or let's not have a transitional campground, that would be too radical. If it's actually available on April 17th, none of these altogether will be effective for dealing with that. So what are we really talking about? It's a fantasy that these two city manager staff people are talking about. And this is going to ignore whether folks will actually go to the location that punishes addicts, establishes curfews, and treats residents as prisoners or unruly children. Others will provide documentation that the staff's proposal, while tailored to please the fearful, simply doesn't pass the straight face test, ignoring real numbers. The alternative on April 17th is now going to be to flood the neighborhoods and the green belts with individuals camping alone or in groups that lack community protection and support. The council must return to its wise decision February 26th to eliminate the Ross Camp closing date. You can't do it unless you have the shelter. You can't do it legally. You can't do it sensibly. And it's going to antagonize the very people in this audience that you're concerned with. And please move that resolution, council.
Okay, your time is up. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and bring it back for action and deliberation. It was brought to my attention that we wanted to have a response from our city staff in terms of some new information, so please.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. I'm Lee Butler, the Director of Planning and Community Development, and wanted to also add for your consideration some of the permitting processes associated with the 3 sites that have been recommended, as particularly the timing associated with those may help to inform the decisions that you make this evening. So there are multiple options by which we can approve these safe sleeping sites, and the first would be through, if it's located on a public park, the parks director could revise the hours of the park and authorize this use. That would be no hearing. And I should mention, we would explore any of these as the most expeditious way. So just the options to consider. The second would be a special event permit could be issued with various conditions that also would not have a hearing. The third would be there's a potential for an administrative or a special use permit. And that, depending on whether it's an administrative or a special use permit, could start with the zoning administrator without a hearing, but then could be appealed to the Planning Commission, and then that could be appealed to the council. In terms of the timing associated with that, that approach would benefit from the additional text that was added into the emergency shelter declaration crisis that said, bring these things directly to the council, because that appeal process can take some time. And so to expedite that, if we were taking the route of an administrative or special use permit, the additional language in that emergency shelter crisis would be beneficial from a timing perspective. And finally, the fourth thing that needs to be considered is the coastal zone. There are 2 of the properties in the coastal zone, and whether or not they would have to go through a coastal permit or a coastal exclusion. So on the Jesse Street Marsh, we could look at the Parks Director revising the hours. We could look at a special event permit with various conditions, and we could look at an administrative or special use. The thing that could create some additional time on the Jesse Street Marsh and the East Cliff Drive project, as it's identified here, is that the Coastal Commission has direct permit authority on that site. So either we would have two options. We would go through the Coastal Commission for a coastal permit, or the council could direct us to, through that emergency shelter declaration crisis, direct us to circumvent that process and proceed. So that would be the council's direction. And that site is doable. We, as Bonnie mentioned before, we were looking at the higher ground away from the marsh area, but there's still permitting challenges associated with that, depending on the route that we take. Particularly if we go through the Coastal Commission, it could take some longer, a longer time period. On Lot 24, north of Depot Park, a special event permit could be issued. No hearing for that. An administrative or special use permit could also be utilized. And for this one, while it's in the coastal zone, we would likely qualify for an exclusion. And so that would not necessarily add to the time associated with the permitting for that. And then finally, the San Lorenzo Park site, the Parks Director would have the option, or a special event permit could be used. We could also go the administrative or special use permit route. And this is outside of the coastal zone, so no coastal permit would be needed. It is, we would be looking at the San Lorenzo Park Urban River Management Plan to evaluate how it's best conforming to that, and making sure that we're protecting the resources that we have, environmental resources in close proximity. And Bonnie mentioned many of these sites have various constraints. I just wanted to sort of highlight some of the permitting steps and the timing associated with those, as that may help inform the deliberations.
Okay, we'll return it back for council action. Vice Mayor Cummings?
I'm prepared to make a motion on the declaration of a shelter crisis.
Okay. Are you only prepared to make a motion on that portion of the agenda?
Yes, just that portion.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead and make that motion at this time? Or
Yeah. Given the fact that some of these, well, not the scenarios presented to us today, but in other circumstances, that there might be negative environmental impacts that should be assessed. And for those reasons, among others, that the proposal of some of these camps should go through planning process, I'm prepared to take no action on this item at this point in time with regards to declaring and updating the shelter crisis declaration.
So there's a motion to not pursue the updated shelter declaration crisis by Vice Mayor Cummings. Is there a second? I'll go ahead and second that. I too wanted to also think about how, I'll second it for the reasons that I think you already alluded to, and also how if we're moving forward with the 2x2, with and in concert with the county, how are we taking the time to look at alignment in terms of strategies? So I would like to take that time personally. So that's sort of the direction I'm in. Councilmember Brown and then Councilmember.
For this, can I get some clarification? The motion is to take no action. Is the motion to defer this to a future date, or just drop it?
To leave it as is what my understanding of the motion.
To leave it the current shelter crisis as is, the current declaration that we have in place as is.
Councilmember Matthews.
I was actually prepared to support the revised declaration with additional changes having to do with the required permitting process, making it clear that any exemptions would be only for fully managed, staffed, and secure facilities, and amending the declaration expressly to involve the county, and also that it would remain in effect only for 1 year unless renewed by a council. I would like to know from staff what benefits they see from, or what the implications would be from staying with the existing declaration. As I understand it, that would make it hard to move forward with what we're planning.
I think the predominant difference between the two is that language that Director Butler referenced about expediting the process. So absent that, depending on what site council selects, we will have to look at the normal trajectory of reviews and go through those normal processes. So that will delay, most likely, or could delay, could delay the ability to activate that site and open that up for a safe sleeping program and close down the Gateway encampment. So that was the one piece we felt actually helped hasten the ability to get something before a public hearing at council and get it open as quickly as possible.
Councilor
If I could just follow up, I mean, we did vote just at our last meeting to reaffirming our intention to close the Ross encampment, and I support that. I support our move to close that camp and find alternative and safer options for those who are currently there. So I do support the idea of moving towards a small pilot, limited, secure, managed, safe sleeping and storage option as the necessary component for closing down the Ross camp. So again, I'm going to ask if we did not move forward with an amendment to move any permitting process directly to City Council, that would discard the target date that we had previously set for closing the Ross camp. Am I correct in that?
So it depends on the site that you kind of rises to the top in terms of council consideration. So as Director Butler mentioned, each site has different constraints in terms of permitting and process and timeline. So one thing that the council may consider in your deliberations is to get a little further along as to that site selection process, so we can think about the shelter declaration within the context of the requirements to move forward quickly with that site, rather than kind of deliberating on that at this point. But yes, there is potential that it would move that April 17th date either somewhat or significantly, depending on the process.
Could I just, and then I'm sorry, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to get a quick clarification on that, because but the assumption is that the recommendations by the 2x2 with the additional bed space of 60 in addition to the increased capacity is not going to be sufficient, but we don't quite know that, essentially. Is that correct? And that's why the additional site is necessary? Or is that the assumption?
So the assumption is that we need those additional 50 beds. So we need 100 beds. That is the current assumption. So we will be further evaluating the current census, the sleeping census at the encampment, with the help of the camp council. But the current assumption, based on our best knowledge to date, is that the 100 beds is what we should be striving for.
Councilman.
Thank you. Can I just get some clarification on the language here? Because the Vice Mayor alluded to the issue of the potential need for environmental review, but from your presentation and from the struck language here, can you remind me as to the removal of the 2 paragraphs at the bottom of page 3 that specifically remove the specifications that CEQA could be taken out? Am I reading that wrong? Yeah, so those ones.
Right here. Yeah.
Right.
So I have it up on the screen, and there are 2 companion whereas clauses earlier in the declaration. So here, again, there's a very different voice with the existing shelter crisis declaration in this one. The first one was based on the city of Santa Rosa. This one was based on a legal document produced by the city of San Diego, and it had this stronger language. But our sense in that reviewing the situation, hearing the feedback about what people thought that this might portend, that it actually wasn't necessary, that we would have regular channels where we could do evaluation or have exemptions, especially because these are temporary uses. So we thought, well, this probably isn't a tool that we would need to flex. And because it did give rise to concerns in the community, we thought it best to strike it out.
So there would need to be environmental reviews because of the concern that it was causing within the community based off of this language? I just want to get a clarity on that.
Not necessarily. Again, this depends on the site. And, this is where we're working so quickly. I do offer our apologies to the council week over week. I mean, it's every day we're exploring new dimensions, and it's not normally done this quickly. So we don't have everything fully explained. But as Director Butler outlined, we actually do have a few different permitting pathways as well. So I also want to kind of append my answer of a moment ago about what would the existing shelter crisis be missing, and marry it with your question. We could modify hours in parks by the Parks and Rec director. We could issue a special event permit, and we do have a precedent for this. When there was the Occupy demonstration in San Lorenzo Park, a special event permit was issued for that. I think what this really hinges on is the temporary use. So really, if we're just thinking 30 days, which is what was proposed here, I think we're in a very different class of review. It is very much a temporary use, and I don't know if Director Butler wants to add anything else about environmental review, but I think that we can operate, and I don't think there'd be a high level of review.
Okay.
I'm looking at the city attorney too.
Anything else? Otherwise, I have one more question.
No, that's right. The language that was originally drafted was intentionally very sweeping, and we realized after talking it over further and listening to comments from council members and from members of the public that there were paths by which we could establish temporary shelter programs and facilities that would entail conducting some environmental review, but would likely fall under different categorical exemptions, and so would not become a long, drawn-out process to evaluate in accordance with the requirements of CEQA.
Thanks. And I know the intention is not to have to use it, but the ability to potentially use it if we need to be able to move as quickly as possible, and understanding the timeline that we're under and the severe situation that people are experiencing on the street, the impact that neighbors are having with regards to issues in their communities. I'm going to then make a substitute motion to adopt the revised shelter declaration.
Second.
Okay, substitute motion by Councilmember Glover, seconded by Councilmember Crone. Okay, so then we'll go ahead and vote on the substitute motion at this time. Is that correct, or further discussion?
Whether to accept the substitute motion.
Okay, we'll vote to whether to accept the substitute motion.
Does that allow for amendments to the substitute motion once it's considered?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, all those in favor and support of the substitute motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No.
No.
Aye. Okay, so that passes with Councilmember Crone, Glover, Brown, and Matthews in support, Councilmember Myers, Vice Mayor Cummings, and myself against. So the substitute motion is on the floor to approve the resolution with the modifications that I believe will be suggested by Councilmember
I would
Matthews.
like to add some potential amendments to that. One would be, let me find them. That shelters not be placed in parks, beaches, streets, and sidewalks without first requiring a public permit process. The next would be amending the declaration so it only allows public exemptions for fully managed, professionally staffed, and secure shelter facilities. The declaration be amended so it expressly requests the county supervisors create shelter locations. I would amend that, create shelter or other homeless service locations outside the city and have the county bear its fair share of the responsibility for serving the homeless population. And finally, the declaration remain in effect for 1 year unless renewed by council.
Are those amendments?
So 3, 4, and 5, I believe I can accept. I just need more clarity on 1 and 2. If
Only had
maybe part 4 had.
Okay, so the
maybe
first
part 4
one.
had 2 parts.
one is that
They're over there. Can we see them?
amending the declaration so that shelters cannot be placed in parks, beaches, streets, and sidewalks without first requiring a public permit process.
Okay, so I'm just unclear as to what a
public permit process entails. Could you, or Director Butler, clarify?
I would say that would just have to be, and I should say in that, that public review process could be handled directly by the city council rather than going through the lower planning processes.
I can accept that. And the second one, I'm sorry.
Amending the declaration so it only allows public exemptions of various requirements and standards for fully managed, professionally staffed, and secure shelter facilities.
So with that, because transitional encampment models have the aspect of self-governance, but are overseen by a professional nonprofit, and each of the volunteers goes through a specific and certified kind of training program that allows them to volunteer for 4 hours a week, which creates that community. And what we heard from the different members of the community with regards to the drug addiction issue, if you ask the majority of drug addiction specialists, one of the main solutions to drug addiction is the feeling of connection and community. So, and working away from isolation and kind of marginalization. So I think that having the ability for camp residents eventually to be able to participate in some kind of a functionary role at the camp is important and essential. So if that's taken out by only professional paid, whatever the staff description you had it, then that'll be, I won't be able to accept that. But I want to clarify so to make sure maybe we're on the same page.
Okay. Apparently not.
Okay, Councilmember Brown?
So well, put another way, would self-governance of some sort and engagement be precluded, assuming there is an operator that's managing the site?
This is a question,
Councilmember Matthews.
This language requires fully managed and professionally staffed. And I should also say that it will have gone through a permit process and there will be conditions of approval for a permit.
I'm just trying to understand the distinction because I don't see how those two is mutually exclusive.
Well, I am not in favor of a self-managed facility.
Okay. Okay, Councilmember Butler.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that it's not self-managed because it's managed by a nonprofit, but there is responsibilities given to the volunteers in order to be able to stay at the facility. So it requires buy-in and participation.
So essentially, if I'm understanding everybody correctly, that there is an understanding of a professional staff managing the camp.
Yes.
Okay. Is that?
But the inclusion of volunteer participation from
with nuances
participants.
For inclusion.
Because then I can accept it.
Anything in the world can have volunteers. I'm concerned about professional management.
That's a component that's
part
been
of
accepted.
it. Yep, absolutely.
Does that work? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, I can accept those.
Do you accept those as well as the seconder of the motion, Councilmember Crone?
I had a question about, is there language that we can put in there that does codify or make sure that there is going to be an element of self-governance within the camp?
I think that as it comes up before us for deliberation, we can decide on that within the permitting process of the camp and facility, and then the group can decide.
I had a question for Councilmember Matthews. When you said have county bear its fair share, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean we're just asking them, or we're
can't force them to do anything?
Right.
We are in a 2x2 process.
Yeah. We're not going to not do something because they're not going to do something, right? Okay.
Expression of intent.
Okay, so it appears that the friendly amendments proposed by Councilmember Matthews have been accepted by the maker of the motion, the seconder of the motion. Okay, so we'll go ahead and vote on that and then move on to the additional items before us.
And I've been trying to capture what I'm hearing. I don't know, is it down there on the TV in front of you? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to, does this sound, I haven't gotten the third. So be it further resolved that no shelter may be placed in parks, beaches, streets, and sidewalks without first requiring public review.
And permitting process.
Public review.
And permitting process.
Permitting process, thank you. Be it further resolved that shelters must be fully managed and professionally staffed and secure. And I didn't catch the end of that dialogue. How was this?
I think what they landed on is when it comes for the permitting process that elements around self-governance would be considered within those conditions.
as a component of professionally run.
So let me just amplify a bit. Without first requiring public review and permitting process with conditions of approval to be handled directly at the city council level.
And then the final was, be it further resolved that the County of Santa Cruz is requested. Was there a way that you phrased that?
Amend the declarations expressly requesting that the County of Santa Cruz create or locate homeless serving facilities outside the city limits and bear its fair responsibility.
Serving services.
And this is just a statement of what we've already expressed.
And bear their fair
and
share.
bear its fair responsibility of meeting the needs of the homeless population.
Share of the responsibility.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fair share.
It's with an apostrophe, yes.
Of the homeless community? Okay, and let's see, what typos do I have?
No, so far you're pretty
Population is
There
what I
is.
said, but
Yeah, I think Councilmember Glover said that. Thank you. Okay.
Councilmember Myers?
Was there also a term?
yes, excuse me, you were right, that the declaration remain in effect for 1 year unless renewed by council. That's a change to some other language. There is language in the revised one that says it remains in force until terminated.
Until terminated,
Okay.
This gives a sunset.
Everyone needed it.
No.
Vice Mayor Cummings?
It's an extension.
And another friendly amendment to the declaration.
Oh, is it somewhere else in there? Okay.
Which would state that, be it further resolved, that the city initiate a process for collecting demographic information necessary to the process of developing a sustainable and outcome-based homeless policy, including such information as may relate to the work history, residence and life history, family, criminal history, eligibility for government or private support, disabilities, special needs, and other relevant data related to the individuals to be served in the described shelters and facilities. Said information, I can email this to you as well. Said information shall be confidential as to the subject individual to whom it relates, but shall be made aggregated and made available to the city council, city staff, and the public at large in a format that does not identify the individuals to whom it relates. So the idea being that we're able to capture information on the people who are coming in and out of the camps, understanding different aspects of their history so that we can better provide them the best resources possible, and also understand whether or not, given the fact that some people in the community are concerned with people who may be sex offenders at the camps or have some history, that information be collected as well so that we know more about the people who we're serving at the camps.
Okay, we have a friendly amendment by Vice Mayor Cummings. It looks like a question by Councilmember Brown.
And I have a question as well on that.
Okay.
Hi, Vice Mayor Cummings. I understand where you're coming from and potentially going with that that friendly amendment. I'm just wondering if a resolution is the place to direct this action, because the resolution would be kind of a blanket statement, whereas this is requesting some information gathering and I think we can do that outside of the resolution itself. So I just don't know. Maybe staff, you can suggest how best to address that.
I believe we've been directed to do this already.
Yeah.
I think 2 meetings ago, this was part of, I believe, the February 26th meeting.
I believe it was at the last meeting.
Thank you, March 12th.
And it really was around the needs assessment, gap analysis, really understanding the demographic that we're serving, not to the level of specificity that Vice Mayor Cummings provided, but I think we could use that language in further defining the process for which we'll get to what we might be calling a shelter feasibility study or kind of a gap analysis in terms of who we're serving and how best to serve them.
So just to follow up, what would the appropriate action be for us to ensure that that language is included in the previous, in further some further direction about that? How would we do that?
No, if we do you think we need a motion?
Councilmember Matthews, and then
Maybe an idea on that. I think, as a directive for all of that, that's extremely specific, and you have to figure out the capacity to collect that information. I think the general direction was given previously. Certainly, some sort of information gathering could be part of a permitting process. The conditions of approval could be for operations and gathering of information on individuals served.
Yeah, so I think maybe we're talking about two distinct things. What I heard Vice Mayor Cummings talking about was more of looking generally at our population at large and understanding the current conditions for which, if we have unsanctioned encampments, notwithstanding the gateway encampment, that we have a better understanding of who is that population and how best to serve them. That is definitely part of this, what we will be taking to the 2x2 in terms of a needs assessment and better understanding that. As it relates to individual programs, certainly we can have that kind of more data-driven analysis of how best to serve the clients that we're trying to attract and have that discussion with the council as we consider permits.
Vice Mayor Cummings, does that?
I'd just like to say just one more comment on this. And the reason why this is being suggested is because of the fact that if this comes up again in the future, when we have to declare another shelter crisis, that this be incorporated in, so it is a part of the process when we begin to move forward. But I'd be if staff is already moving forward with this, I'd be happy to remove my friendly amendment at this point in time.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and have the record reflect that the friendly amendment was withdrawn at this point. Okay, Councilmember Crone.
Just wondering, how is that information collected? It sounds like a tall order what Vice Mayor put out there, and are we contracting with somebody to come in and collect this information?
So those questions have not been resolved yet. So the process for which I would imagine this to take place is the county has already entered into a contract with a consulting firm that's doing a systems analysis with regard to homelessness service in the county. We are engaging with the county on whether this analysis could be added to their current scope. If that is not the case, we would have to return to council with some direction as to hiring a consultant to do this work.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor by Councilmember Glover, seconded by Councilmember Crone, with the incorporation of Councilmember Matthews' information. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No.
No.
Okay, so that passes with Councilmember Brown, Matthews, Crone, Glover in support, Vice Mayor Cummings, Councilmember Myers, and myself voting against. Okay. Councilmember Glover.
I'd like to move on the staff recommendation to direct the city manager to implement a small-scale safe sleeping and storage program, as well as selecting a site.
Okay. I would second that, but I wanted to ask what the difference was between the a small-scale safe sleeping and storage versus the encampment. What is a small-scale safe sleeping and storage? Where does that happen?
Wait, I'm sorry. Where does that happen?
Yeah, what is it?
So maybe we could return to the slide that talks about the distinction between the two. So it's virtually the same as a transitional encampment with regard to the population that we're trying to serve, the amount of capacity that we're talking about. So we were provided direction last week to provide sites for up to 50 individuals. In terms of rules of conduct and how those programs would be managed, we would expect, and especially based on today's conversation, to have them professionally managed by a nonprofit or, quite frankly, the city would also have to be part of that conversation in terms of us, again, going into the business of operating a shelter. So one of those two bodies would be moving forward with the operations. The distinction between safe sleeping and transitional encampments is really the time of day for which people would be expected to be on the facility. The safe sleeping is really a dusk to dawn program, say 9 p.m. to 6 a.m., and then people would be expected to vacate the area and then come back later that next evening. In terms of the rules of conduct, they would be very similar between the two. The distinction also is that safe sleeping, although there are some programs that I've seen in my research where there is some level of self-governance, it would be a fully professionally managed program. We would, based on actually council direction from several meetings ago, security would be required. And in addition to that, it really is, intended to be accessible by foot, day to day for folks, and then also be fully flexible in terms of who we are allowing in, as long as they're adhering to those rules of conduct.
Where would it be?
That's up to you guys.
Are you saying that it's going to be in the sites that have been identified by the three sites?
Those are the sites that we would like for you to deliberate on this evening.
So just for clarity, my understanding is that if we are pursuing a safe sleeping site, then the ask from staff is for the council tonight to choose one of the three sites as the interim sort of pilot location. Does that reflect?
Yeah, recommend a preferred site.
Recommend a preferred site. Councilmember Myers.
And I've heard that this would be a site that would be at this point for 30 days. Is that correct? Is that your recommendation? So we're looking for the site, and then the facility would be a safe sleeping and storage. And right now the recommendation is 30 days. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Tina did allude to that. So at this time, I think it would be beneficial for the council to consider this as a 30-day renewable kind of month-by-month program based on several factors. We are not getting to the results that council has been considering over the last couple meetings as with regard to a very deliberate 6-month, say, pilot. But I do believe if we have the ability to, on a month-by-month basis, really evaluate the effectiveness of the program, really think about how questions around compatibility are taken under consideration, really think about what those performance metrics should look like from the perspective not of only clients of the safe sleeping program, but also safety concerns in the neighborhood. I think it is beneficial for the council to consider a really short-term program that we will re-engage with the council on a month-by-month basis to ensure that we can keep moving forward.
Okay.
Point of order. I just want to let the folks who are here know what we're doing and when this might end, because they came for something else that was supposed to start at 7 o'clock. Right. Can we give them an idea of possibly when we might be finished deliberating here?
We could move this right along if you'd like. At this point, it's just a matter of us deciding which location, if a location is selected, and moving forward with the interim site. So we could essentially wrap it up in about 5-10 minutes, or we could go.
Thanks. I just want to let them know.
Sure.
Thanks.
Councilmember Myers.
I just have one additional question. Will the however many sites based on the site, will those be offered to folks at the Ross camp as that is scheduled for closure?
If I'm understanding correctly.
Is that the priority for these
Absolutely.
sites?
Yes.
Thank you.
And if I could, and then and the recommendation based on sort of all the different considerations was the San Lorenzo site. Is that clear from staff, or am I?
So I might have to yield to Director Butler on this, but I don't think any of the sites is absolutely preferable. I think what we have determined over the last few hours as we've been sitting here in these discussions is that the Jesse Street Marsh site requires a coastal permit. It's kind of outside of our jurisdiction, and so will require more time. From that perspective, I do believe that lowers it in terms of our ability to move swiftly on it. So we're down to Lot 24 and the San Lorenzo Park benchlands. Neither of those sites is ideal, obviously, but I do believe both of them can be implemented in about the same amount of time.
Okay, Councilmember Matthews and then Councilmember Glover.
We are talking about a 30-day renewable. And in reference to, I think it was Donna's question, being made available to those who are currently at the Ross site, if they agree to the conditions. This is a clearly managed, relatively high barrier.
Yeah, as it relates to rules of conduct, absolutely.
Yeah. So so now we're down, if I'm hearing you correctly, in terms of the two that the council could prioritize are Site 2 and Site 5, essentially. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, Councilmember Glover.
Thanks. And to my understanding, neither of those sites will provide enough space in collaboration, even with the Salvation Army and the 1220 River Street, to accommodate all of the people at the site, specifically the Ross camp. Is that a correct assertion?
No, I don't believe that's a correct assertion. I think between River Street Camp, 50 sites at either lot 24 or the benchlands, in addition to capacity that might be at our other sheltering options, that is our target number that we expect to be trying to achieve to close the encampment.
And 50, so just because we didn't have the tent layout like we did with lot 24, you would anticipate that there would be a total of 50 if we open up both the sites, or 50, say, at the San Lorenzo Benchlands?
No, I think either site we can likely, we have to get down to the granularity here, but the intention is to fit 50 individuals at either of the sites, not combined.
And what is the feasibility of, since after I spoke with the fire chief about, and also the people at the camp, the feasibility of exploring the Pogonip?
At this time, I would not recommend moving forward with the Pogonip. We put a ton of consideration into the Pogonip for a year or so ago for the purposes of the River Street camp. That requires. It has accessibility issues, especially for public safety personnel, AMR personnel. The road all the way up to the clubhouse is quite challenging. In addition, just the level of accessibility, quite frankly, for folks who are mobility impaired, I think would be extremely challenging for folks. This really needs to be a site that people can access pretty easily. So that would not be my recommendation at this time.
Okay.
So given the information, does the council member want to move with a recommendation to pursue a safe sleeping site at either of the two locations? To entertain a motion to move this along.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Councilmember Glover.
My concerns with lot 24, just so you can add it to the slide, is the proximity to the gentleman's business that spoke. There he is. Yeah, absolutely. So wanting to make sure that there's enough kind of thought put into it so that whatever concerns he has are taken into consideration with that space. I think that if we can, my only concern there also is the proximity. I know that there's an issue with the density at the Ross camp, and so if we're trying to cram 50 people into a place where only 27 10 by 10 tent mock-ups could fit, I'm just concerned about the density there. Other things, I like that it's centrally located. I like that it's a pre-existing lot that doesn't have as big of an environmental impact. So that's a positive aspect to it. And it's pretty close to transit since it's downtown. So that is a benefit also. The San Lorenzo Benchlands, both sites lack privacy. I think that's a big issue for the people that are there. Luckily, we'll put up the mesh netting, so that's a possibility. San Lorenzo Park is the proximity to the playground as a problem that have been voiced by the community, but it has a bigger footprint, I think. So we'll be able to have less density, and it's not directly located next to a business.
Councilmember Glover, one point of clarification. So the slide that Bonnie showed with regard to Lot 24 really reflected what I would consider a transitional encampment configuration, not necessarily safe sleeping configuration. So for other dusted on programs, there is the potential of having a large pop-up structure that actually houses a number of people in a small space in addition to individual tents. So in terms of density and kind of how best to fit that within this context, I think there's more flexibility than we're currently demonstrating and envisioning. And those dusted on programs typically do allow for a myriad of different sleeping situations, and it's not all individual tents. And those tents that we would also allow could not be huge. I mean, they'd have to be pretty nominal in size.
Okay, so were you finished?
Yeah, taking into consideration and the community and making sure that there's the inclusion of community conversation around it, it seems like Lot 24. So I'd make a motion to establish a safe sleeping site at Lot 24.
Okay, there's a motion by Councilmember Glover to establish a safe sleeping site at Lot 24. Is there a second?
I'd like to hear other council members weigh in. I mean, I personally don't want to see it in a park. I think that this would, if we're going in this direction, this would be the best place. It's a degraded, it's an asphalt area. It's not in a park. And I think it would be a better way to go. If other council members are, I don't know what you're going to propose, if anything, and we're going to leave it here like this and just move on to our next meeting.
Is that a second?
I'll second it for discussion.
Okay, so we have a motion by Councilmember Glover, a second by Councilmember Crone. Further discussion, Councilmember.
Yeah, another consideration is it is immediately across from the soccer field that's used during all daylight hours. And it is also a heavily used lot, both for the parking permits and the residential areas, the apartments nearby, and public parking during the summertime. So there's a lot of demand there. And on the other hand, the one by the San Lorenzo Park, my concern about that is, for lack of a better term, the fallout during the daytime. I mean, the San Lorenzo Park has been so impacted by, let's just say, negative uses, chop shops and drug dealing and all sorts of stuff over time that's made it really unusable for long periods of time. It's clearly there's no good site. If there were, we would have found it. So I guess I'm gravitating to 24, kind of against my best instincts, but I think we are looking at it as a 30-day temporary renewable.
Councilmember Glover?
Thank you. I just realized that we have members in the audience that are providing their own solutions or suggestions, and we haven't even spoken about them yet. So there's one here about the Locust Street Garage that someone brought up during public comment, and then I saw another suggestion out there about actually positioning the transitional space on the soccer field, which is named after Scott Kennedy, founder of the Resource Center for Nonviolence, and who I believe would be open to closing his soccer field to allow for us to do some transitional or temporary sleep spaces. So with the staff, I would ask the question, what are your thoughts on the Locust Street Garage and putting it on Depot Park or Scott Kennedy Field?
I'm looking for a public works director to maybe weigh in, thank you, Mark, to weigh in the Locust Street Garage. I mean, I can say generally the lower level Locust Street Garage, that entire garage is used very, very heavily. I think it's maybe fully subscribed with parking permits, or if not nearly subscribed. So I think that it was taken out because of one of our initial criteria. We're looking at conflicting uses, and we already have de facto contracts with people to park their vehicles. So, but
Before you do, if I may, just in the interest of time and in the interest of also many, many options to consider, and considering the kind of the item before us, I'm wondering if we could potentially have this conversation offline or revisit it at a future time, given that there's many, many sites to explore.
Then I would change the motion to move the conversation of the establishment of a safe sleeping zone or a transitional encampment or safe parking program to the April 9th council meeting, and make sure that we secure the language that the Ross camp will not be closed unless there is ample shelter space for those currently living in the camp at that period of time.
Is that a motion that's part of the motion that's on the...
Withdraw my original motion and then put a new one on there that says we move the decision-making to April 9th on these issues.
Second.
Okay.
So I suspect had we given Director Dettel an opportunity to discuss the Locust Street garage, I don't think we would. I think we'd have a strong suggestion not to consider that at this time.
By all means.
And in addition to that, I think we would also have significant challenges with Depot Field. So it would be my strong preference for us to try to move forward. I think April 9th is too close to when we're trying to make a difference with regard to the encampment, and then also with trying to open up the River Street program and this program at the same time. We are moving forward with a Salvation Army, and we would essentially be postponing opening that program and serving our community and not moving forward quickly. So I do think it would be beneficial for the council to try to do this tonight.
Would that help if you heard from our public works director?
Yeah, so based off of that staff recommendation, then I'll stick with my original motion to instruct staff to look at or to implement a small-scale safe sleeping and storage site for up to 50 people, or 50 people, make that solid language, and to use lot 24 with a community input and problem-solving process to address the issue of the proximity to the business.
Okay, so that's the original motion that was made by Councilmember Glover and seconded by Councilmember.
Second, and I would call the question just in the interest of time here.
Second that.
So the question has been called at this time.
No further
discussion. Okay, so so if the question is called, then we will vote to accept the motion as is at this time, correct?
Vote to call the question.
Vote to call the question.
Right.
And if we don't call the question, we could entertain a clarifying.
I believe if you vote to call the question, then you just have to take the vote after the vote is made to call the question.
Okay, so we'll take the vote to call the question. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
No? No. Okay, so that fails with Councilmember Brown, Matthews, Vice Mayor Cummings, and myself voting. I'm sorry. The question was called. Councilmember Crone, Glover, and Myers voted in favor. Councilmember Brown, Matthews, Vice Mayor Cummings, and myself voting against. So we can go ahead and revisit the conversation around the motion. In interest of hearing whatever you wanted addressed, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you. I just want to affirm that this is for a 30-day period renewable in 30-day increments. That was understood in the discussion, but I'd like to have that included in the motion. Is that agreeable?
Yeah, my only concern with that is the lack of continuity. Like, I understand 30 days is a comfortable monthly, just like a rent kind of structure, but I think there should be some kind of continuity to be able to get good data, so it's not just a month of data, and then if we decide to close it because it's a bad month for whatever reason, which I don't imagine it would be, but like, why not do it for 90 days and then reassess, or 60 days, but why 30 days?
because that's how it's been described to us up to this point.
Susie?
So I think we can get to some of your questions when we go through the permitting process as to what those performance metrics would look like and how to best collect data for which you can make an informed decision. So I think for, the intentionality around the 30 days was really just to have more touch points with the council and more touch points with the community, quite frankly, in terms of how the program is fitting into the neighborhood, in consideration of not only the clients we're serving, but also those potential impacts, either real or perceived, with the adjacent uses.
Yeah, I can accept that, but I do just want to make sure that, and maybe my seconder will approve of this, but I want to make sure that there's language in there that says that we will not close the Ross camp until we for sure have the shelter spaces available. Because for some people it was a little bit unclear in the last minutes or in the agenda report. So I just want to make sure that there's the 50 beds on top of the 60 from the 1220 and then the Salvation Army.
Yeah, and I think that's in the previous direction from last week.
Cool. Just want to make sure that that's the language.
Yes.
All right. Cool.
And that is the language that was adopted last week.
Okay, so it looks like we're there. So we'll go ahead and vote on the motion made by Councilmember Glover, seconded by Councilmember Crone, with the clarification asked by Councilmember
I asked for
Matthews.
one clarifying point.
Sure.
We did hear a presentation earlier in the evening on the adoption of some standard operating procedures to ensure that the camp is closed in a way that's consistent with Martin versus Boise and the line of cases that have started following it. So I was wondering if the maker would incorporate the implementation of a standard operating procedures guide to bring back to the council for consideration at a future meeting as well.
That was.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like that was implied. That's officially
Yeah,
now
absolutely.
being
Sounds good.
incorporated. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
That passes with Councilmember Crone, Glover, Brown, Matthews in support, Vice Mayor Cummings, Myers, and myself voting against. Okay, so that will conclude the item. I think we got there. And we'll go ahead and take a brief break and reconvene for our delayed, and I apologize for the delay for the remainder of our evening session. So we'll take a recess. We have maybe 15 minutes?
I would say 5 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. 10 minutes to eat. Okay, we'll get back. Thank you.